The Moon of Gomrath by Garner. Read by Robert Powell. It was bleak on Mottram Road under the Edge, the wooded hill of Alderley. Trees roared high in the Pennine wind. From a rib of the edge a shaft of blue light cut the darkness. It came from a narrow opening in a high, tooth-shaped rock, and within the opening was a pair of iron gates, and beyond them a tunnel. Shadows moved on the trees as a procession entered through the gates and down into the hill. They were a small people, not more than 4 feet high, deep-chested with narrow waists and long, slender arms and legs. They wore short tunics, and some had cloaks of white eagle feathers. They carried deeply curved bows, and from their belts hung on one side quivers of white arrows, and on the other broad stabbing swords. Each rode a small white horse, and some sat proudly erect, though most drooped over the pommels of their saddles, and a few lay irrevocably still across their horses' necks. Altogether they numbered close on 500. Beside the iron gate stood an old man. He was tall and thin. His white robes and long white hair and beard flew with the gale, and he held a white staff in his hand. Slowly the horsemen filed through the gates into the tunnel, and when they were all inside the old man followed them. The iron gate swung shut behind him, and there was just a bare rock in the wind. In this way, the elves of Sinadon came to Fundindelv, last stronghold of the high magic in our days, and were met by Cadellin Silverbrow, a great wizard, and guardian of the secret places of the Edge.
"Hey up," said Garner Mossock. "What's this here in the advertiser?"
Colin and Susan leant forward to look. Plumbing the depths. Speculation has been aroused by the discovery of what appears to be a 30-foot well during excavations in front of the Trafford Arms Hotel, Alderley Edge. While workmen were digging to trace a surface water drain, they moved a stone flag and discovered a cavity. The lowering of a weighted string showed that the depth was 30 feet, with 15 feet of water, and although the whole of the covering was not removed, it was estimated that the cavity was about 6 feet square with stone walls. It has been suggested that at one time there was a pump in front of the hotel, and that excavations have revealed the well from which water was pumped. Another theory is that it may be an air shaft connected with the ancient mines.
"As long as I can remember," said Garner when the children had finished reading, "it's always been said there's a tunnel from the copper mines comes out in the cellars of the Trafford. I wonder what the answer is."
"I dunna see as it matters," said Bess Mossock. "Yon's nobbut a wet hole, choose how you look at it, and it can stay there for me." "Could we have a look?" said Susan.
"It's only round the corner," said Garner. "It wouldn't take but a couple of minutes."
"Well, I'll leave you to it," said Bess, "but dunna take all day."
They went out from the chip shop into the village street. Garner and the children walked a short distance up the street to the Trafford Arms. A trench about 3 feet deep had been dug along the front of the building, close against the wall.
"Aye, this is it," said Garner.
The corner of a stone slab was sticking out of the trench wall, and a piece had broken off, making a hole 3 inches wide. Susan jumped into the trench and squinted through the hole.
"Can you see out?"
said Garner.
"It's a round shaft. There seems to be something like a pipe sticking into it. I can't see any more.
Happiness nobber to well, said Gowther. Pity. I've always liked to think there's summat in the outtail.
It was late afternoon before Bess had done her shopping. I suppose you'll be wanting to walk home through the wood again, said Gowther.
Yes, please, said
Colin. Think on you come straight home, said Gowther. It'll be dark in an hour, and them woods are treacherous at night. Colin and Susan walked along the foot of the edge. Every week they did this, and any free time they had was also spent wandering on this hill, searching. They left the road, and for a long time they climbed in silence, deep into the wood. Then Susan spoke.
"Why can't we find Cadellin now?"
"Oh, don't start that again," said Colin. "We never did know how to open the iron gates or the Holy Well entrance, so we're not likely to be able to find him."
"Yes, but why shouldn't he want to see us? I could understand it before, when he knew it wasn't safe for us to come here. But what is there to be scared of now that the Morrigan's out of the way?"
"That's it," said Colin.
"Is she?" "But she must be," said Susan. "Gowther says her house is empty." "I've been thinking about it," said Colin. "The only other time Cadellin did this to us was when he thought she was around."
They had reached the Holy Well. It lay at the foot of a cliff in one of the many valleys of the edge. It was a shallow, oblong stone trough into which water dripped from the rock. Above it was a crack in the rock face, and that, the children knew, was the second gate of Fundindelve. But now, as for weeks past, their calling was not answered. Having once experienced the friendship of Cadellin Silverbrow, they were hurt now that he seemed to have abandoned them without reason. "Come on," said Colin. "Staring won't open it, and if we don't hurry we shan't be home before dark, and you know how Bess likes to fuss." They climbed out of the valley onto the top of the edge. It was dusk. Branches stood against the sky, and twilight ran in the grass, and gathered black in the chasms and tunnel eyes of the old mines which scarred the woodland. There was the sound of wind, though the trees did not move. "What's down there?" said Colin. "Can you see?" They were walking along the side of a quarry. It had not been worked for many years, and its floor was covered with grass, so that only its bare walls made it different from the other valleys of the edge. Here night was gathering very quickly. "Where?" said Susan. "At the other end of the quarry." "No. There it goes. Sue, what is it?" The hollows of the valley were in darkness, and a patch of the darkness was moving, blacker than the rest. It flowed across the grass, shapeless, flat, changing in size, and up the cliff face. Somewhere near the middle, if there was a middle, were two red points of light. It slipped over the edge of the quarry and was absorbed into the bracken. They hurried now. The edge had suddenly become not quite malevolent, but alien, unsafe, and they longed to be clear of the trees, for they kept imagining that there was a white movement among the tree tops. "Do you think there was anything in the quarry?" said Susan. "I don't know. I think it must have been the light." There was a hissing in the air, and sand spurted between them at their feet. There was an arrow, small and white, embedded in the path, and a voice spoke out of the dusk above their heads.
"Move not a sinew of your sinews, nor a vein of your veins, nor a hair of your heads, or I shall send down of slender oaken darts enough to sow you to the earth."
Colin and Susan looked up. Before them, a very old silver birch threw its trunk in an arch across the path, and among the branches stood a slight figure, manlike, yet not 4 feet high. He wore a white tunic, and his skin was wind-brown. The locks of his hair lay close to his head, and his eyes were the eyes of a goat. In his hand was a deeply curved bow. "What do you think you're doing?" Colin shouted. "You nearly hit us with that thing."
"Oh, the Donas! Oh, the holy Mothan! It is himself that can speak to elves!"
Colin and Susan started at the sound of this rich voice that welled with laughter. They turned, and saw another small but stockier figure standing on the path behind them, his red hair glowing darkly in the last light. They had rarely seen such an ugly face. The left eye was covered with a black patch, but the right eye had the life of 2 in it. He was unmistakably a dwarf. He clapped Colin on the shoulder.
"And it is I, Uthakar Hornskin, that love you for it. Hey, now, will his mightiness come down out of yon tree and speak with his friends?"
The white figure in the tree did not move.
"I am thinking there is more need of elf-shot in other parts of the wood this night than here. I see Albanach coming, and he in no quiet mood."
They heard the faint sound of hooves pounding towards them. Nearer and louder they grew, and then out of the night came a black horse, wild-eyed and sweating. Its rider, a tall man, himself clothed in black, called up into the tree. "My lord Atlendor, we have found it, but it is free of the wood to the south and moving too fast for me."
"I go. Albanach shall teach my will to these folk."
The elf ran along the birch trunk and disappeared into the crown. There was a rush of white in the surrounding trees like swirling snow, and a noise of wind in the branches. "I think now," said Albanach, "that the matter is out of Cadellin's hands." "What do you mean?" said Colin. "That will take some telling. And the place for it all is Fundindelv, so let us go together."
"Is there not more urgent business in the wood this night?"
said Uthakar. "Nothing that we can do," said Albanach. "The speed and the eyes of elves are the only hope, and I fear they will not be enough." He dismounted from his horse and walked with the children and the dwarf back along the path. They came to a wide expanse of stone and sand which spilled down the face of the edge. This was Stormy Point. From here they crossed over the rocks to Saddle Bowl, which was a spur of the hill jutting into the plain, and halfway along this stood a tall boulder. "Will you open the gate, Susan?" said Albanach. "But I can't," said Susan. "I've tried often enough." "Colin," said Albanach, "will you put your right hand to the rock and say the word Emalagra?" "Emalagra?" "Again. Emalagra. Emalagra." Nothing happened. "Now, Susan," said Albanach. Susan stepped up to the boulder and put her right hand against it. "Emalagra." A crack appeared in the rock. It grew wider, revealing a pair of iron gates, and beyond these a tunnel, lit by a blue light. "Will you open the gates?" said Albanach. Susan touched the iron gates. They swung open.
"Quickly now," said
Uthakar.
"It is a healthier night within than without."
He hurried the children through the gates, and the rock closed after them. "Why did they open? They wouldn't before," said Susan. "Because you spoke the word," said Albanach. They went with Albanach down the paths of Fundindelv. As they went deeper, the blue light grew pale and strong, and by this the children knew that they were nearing the cave of the sleepers. Here in this cave, waiting through the centuries for the day when Cadellin should rouse him from his enchanted sleep to fight the last battle of the world, lay a king, surrounded by his knights, each with his milk-white mare. The children looked about them, at the cold flames, now white in the core of the magic, flickering over the silver armour, at the horses and the men, and listened to the muted, echoing murmur of their breathing, the beating of the heart of Fundindelv. Finally, they came to a small cave close behind the holy well that the wizard used for his quarters. In it were a few chairs, a table, and a bed of skins. "Where's Cadellin?" said Susan. "He will be with the Lios Alpha, the elves," said Albanach. "Many of them are ill of the smoke sickness, but until he comes, rest you here. There is doubtless much you would know." "There certainly is," said Colin. "Who was that shooting arrows at us?" "The elf lord, Atlendor, son of Narf. He needs your help." "Needs our help?" said Colin. "He went a funny way about getting it." "But I never thought elves would be like that," said Susan. "You are both too hasty," said Albanach. "Danger besets him, and he is a king. No elf has a natural love of men. For it is the dirt and ugliness and unclean air that men have worshipped these 200 years that have driven the Lios Alpha to the trackless places and the broken lands. You should see the smoke sickness in the elves of Talabolion and Sinadun. You should hear it in their lungs. That is what men have done."
"But how can we help?" said Susan.
"I will show you," said Albernac. "Cadellin has spoken against this for many days, and he has good reasons, but now you are here, and I think we must tell you what is wrong. In brief, it is this. There is something hiding in the dead wastes of the Northland, in far Prydain, where the last kingdom of the elves has been made. For a long while now, the numbers of the Leos Alpha have been growing less. Elves vanish. They go without a sign. At first it was by ones and twos, but not long since a whole cantref, the cantref of Granos, was lost. Some great wrong is at work, and to find it and destroy it, Atlendor is bringing his people to him from the south and the west, gathering what magic he can. Susan, will you let him take the Mark of Fola?"
"What's that?"
said Susan. "It is the bracelet that Ancharad Goldenhand gave to you."
"What good is it to Atlendor?" said Susan.
"I do not know," said Albernac, "but any magic may help him. And you have magic there. Did you not open the gates?" Susan looked at the band of ancient silver that she wore on her wrist. It had been given to her on a night of danger and enchantment by Ancharad Goldenhand, the Lady of the Lake. Susan did not know the meaning of the heavy letters that were traced in black in a forgotten script upon the silver, yet she knew that it was no ordinary bracelet.
"Why is it called that?" said Susan.
"There are tales," said Albernac, "that the marks of Fola are from the early magic of the world. I cannot tell its use, but will you give it to Atlendor?"
"I can't,"
said Susan. "But the elves may be destroyed for lack of the mark," said Albernac. "Will you fail them when they most need help?"
"Of course I'll help," said Susan. "It's just that Ancharad told me I must always look after my bracelet. But if Atlendor needs it, I'll go back with him."
At this, Uthakar laughed, but Albernac's face was troubled. "You have me there," he said. "Atlendor will not like this. But let me take it to him, Susan, so that he can try its powers. If they are deaf to him, he will accept your provision more easily."
"And why should himself not be away beyond Banaug sooner than the fox to the wood, and the mark with him?" said Uthakar.
"You do not know the Leos Alpha, Hornskin," said Albernac. "I give you my word that there will be no deceit."
"I trust you," said Susan. "Here you are. Let him see what he can do with it. But please don't keep it any longer than you need."
"I am thinking you are not wise to put off your armour," said Uthakar. "The Morrigan does not forget, and she does not forgive."
"The Morrigan?" said Colin. "Is she after us again?"
The Morrigan was leader of the witch covens called the Morthbrood, and above that she could wake the evil in stones and brew hate from the air, and she was terrible in her strength. Mainly through Colin and Susan, her power had been broken by Cadellin Silverbrow, and they had not been certain that she herself had survived the destruction that had overwhelmed her followers. "The Morthbrood is scattered," said Albernac, "but she has been seen. You had best ask him who brought word of her." He nodded towards Uthakar.
"Have you seen her?" said Colin.
"Have I not?" said the dwarf. "Are you all wanting to know? Well then, here is the tale. On my way south, I came to the hill of the Black Fernbrake in Prydain, and a storm followed me. So I was looking for rocks and heather to make a shelter for the night. I saw a round brown stone, and I put my arms about it to lift it up. And, oh, king of the sun and of the moon and of the bright and fragrant stars, the stone put arms about my neck and was throttling the life of me. Ask not how, for I cannot say, but I plucked myself free, and then the stone was the Morrigan. I sprang at her with my sword, and though she took out my eye, I took off her head. But the head leapt a hard, round leap to the neck again, and she came at me loathingly, and I was much in fear of her.
3 times we fought, and 3 times I lifted her head, and 3 times she was whole again, and I was near death with pain and faintness. So once more I set iron to her shoulders. But when the head was making for the trunk, I put my sword on the neck, and the head played gliong on the blade and sprang up to the skies. Then it began to fall, and I saw that it was aiming at me, so I stepped aside, and it went 6 feet into the ground with the force it had. Was that not the head? Then I heard stones crunching, and a chewing, and a gnawing, and a gnashing, so I thought it was time for me to take my legs along with me, and I went on through the night, and the winnowing, and the snow in it.
They were waiting now for the wizard to come, and while they waited, Uthakar told how Albanach had met him one day, and had spoken of a rumour that something had come out of the ground near Fundindelv, and was being hunted by Cadellin Silverbrow. Long ago, one of the old mischiefs of the world had brought fear to the plain, but it had been caught and imprisoned in a pit at the foot of the edge. Centuries later, through the foolishness of men, it had escaped, and was taken at heavy cost. Albanach's news was that man had loosed the evil a second time.
And there was no knowing in the hard, shrivelling world, said Uthakar, where we might find the Brollachan again.
The Brollachan.
Now the Brollachan, said Uthakar, has eyes and a mouth, and it has no speech, and alas, no shape.
It was beyond comprehension. Yet the shadow that rose in Susan's mind as the dwarf spoke seemed to her to darken the cave. Shortly after this, Cadellin arrived.
"Colin, Susan, what has brought you here?"
"We were stopped by Atlendor, the elf, and then Uthakar and Albanach came," said Susan. "And we've just heard about the elves."
"Susan has given us hope," said Albanach. "I have the mark of Fola here."
"It is noble, Susan," said Cadellin, "but is it wise? The Morrigan."
"We have spoken of her," said Albanach quickly. "The bracelet will not be with me for long, and I do not think that witch-queen will come south yet a while, if Hornskin's tale speaks true. Why else the shape-shifting among rocks, unless she fears pursuit?"
"That is so,"
agreed Cadellin.
"Yet still I do not like to see these children brought even to the threshold of danger."
Cadellin looked at Susan.
"It is not your age, but your humanity that gives me unrest. It is against my wishes that you are here now."
"But why?" cried Susan.
"Why do you think men know us only in legend?" said Cadellin.
"We do not have to avoid you for our safety, as elves must, but rather for your own. In our affairs you are weakest where you should be strong, and there is danger for you not only from evil, but from other matters we touch upon, wild forces, which could destroy one not well acquainted with such things. For these reasons we withdrew from mankind and became a memory, and with the years a superstition, ghosts and terrors for a winter's night, and later a mockery and a disbelief. That is why I must appear so hard." Colin and Susan did not stay long in the cave. Uthakar went with them all the way to the farm, turning back only at the gate. Colin and Susan were aware of his eyes ranging continually backwards and forwards, around and about.
"What's the matter?" said Susan. "What are you looking for?"
"Something I hope I shall not be finding," said Uthakar. "The woods were not empty this night. We were close on the Brollachan, and it is far from here that I hope it is just now."
"But how could you see it, whatever it is?" said Colin. "It's pitch dark tonight."
"You must know the eyes of a dwarf are born to darkness," said Uthakar. "But even you would see the Brollachan, though the night were as black as a wolf's throat. For no matter how black the night, the Brollachan is blacker than that."
When they reached highmost Redmanhay, Susan said,
"Uthakar, what's wrong with the elves? I've always imagined them to be the best of your people."
"Ah," said Uthakar, "they would agree with you, and few would gainsay them. You must judge for yourselves. But I will say this of the Lios Alpha. They are merciless without kindliness, and there are things incomprehensible about them."
About 1/2 mile from highmost Redmanhay, round the shoulder of Clinton Hill, there is a disused and flooded quarry. Where the sides are not cliffs, wooded slopes drop steeply. A broken wind pump creaks. The water is sombre under its brows of cliff, and the trees crowd down to drink. The pump sneers, lonely, green-hued, dark. But peaceful, thought Susan. And that's something. There had been no peace at the farm since their return. 2 days of talk from Colin, and the silences made heavy by the Mossock's uneasiness. For Bess and Gowther knew of the children's past involvement with magic, and they were as troubled by this mixing of the two worlds as Cadellin had been. Susan stood on the edge of a slab of rock that stretched into the water, and lost herself in the grey shadows of fish. She was there a long time, and then a noise made her look up. "Hello! Who are you?" A small black pony was standing at the edge of the water on the other side of the quarry. "What are you doing here?" The pony tossed its mane and snorted. "Come on, then. Here, boy." The pony looked hard at Susan, flicked its tail, then turned and disappeared among the trees. Susan climbed up the slope out of the quarry and into the field. She walked round the wood on the far side and whistled, but nothing happened. "Here, boy! Here, boy! Oh!" The pony was standing right behind her. "You made me jump. Where have you been?" Susan fondled the pony's ears. It thrust its head into her shoulder and closed its velvet black eyes. "Steady, you'll knock me over." For several minutes she stroked its neck. Then reluctantly she pushed it away. "I must go now. I'll come and see you tomorrow." The pony trotted after her. "No, go back, you can't come." But the pony followed Susan all the way across the field, butting her gently with its head and nibbling at her ears. And when she came to climb through the fence into the next field, it put itself between her and the fence and pushed sideways with its sleek belly. "What do you want?" Push. "I've nothing for you." Push. "What is it?" Push. "Do you want me to ride?" "That's it, isn't it? Stand still, then. There, good boy. You have got a long back, haven't you? There. Now, whoa, steady." The moment Susan was astride, the pony wheeled round and set off at full gallop towards the quarry. Susan grabbed the mane with both hands. "Hey, stop!" They were heading straight for the barbed wire at the top of the cliff above the deepest part of the quarry. "No, stop!" The pony turned its head and looked at Susan. Its foaming lips curled back in a grin, and the velvet was gone from the eye. In the heart of the black pupil was a red flame. "No!" Susan screamed. Faster and faster they went. The edge of the cliff cut a hard line against the sky. Susan tried to throw herself from the pony's back, but her fingers were entangled in the mane and her legs clung to the ribs. "No, no, no, no!" The pony soared over the fence and plunged past smooth sandstone down to the water. The splash echoed between the walls. Waves slapped the rock. There were some bubbles. The quarry was silent under the heavy sky. "I'm not waiting any longer," said Bess. "Susan mun get her own tea when she comes in." They sat down at the table and ate without talking. The only sounds were the breathing of Bess and Gowther, the ticking of the clock, the buzz of 2 winter-drugged flies that circled endlessly under the beams. The sky bore down on the farmhouse. "We're for it, reet enough," said Gowther. "And Susan had best hurry if she dunna want a soaking. She ought to be here by now. Where was she for, Colin? Hey up. What's getting into him?" Scamp, the Mossock's lurcher, had begun to bark wildly somewhere close. Gowther put his head out of the window. "That'll do. Hey!" "She said she was going to the quarry for some peace and quiet.
"I've been getting on her nerves," she said.
"What? Hayman's Quarry? You should have said earlier, Colin. It's dangerous." "Oh, drat the dog. Hey, Scamp, that's enough. Do you hear?"
"Oh," said Bess. "Whatever's to do with you? Where have you been?" Susan was standing in the doorway. Her hair was thick with mud, and a pool of water was gathering at her feet.
"The Quarry," said Garner. "She mun have falled in. What were you thinking of, Susan, to go and do that?"
"Bath and bed," said Bess. "Eh, dear." She took Susan by the arm and bustled her out of sight. "Goodness knows what happened," said Bess when she came downstairs half an hour later. "Her hair was full of sand and weed, but I couldn't get a word out of her. She seems mazed. Happen she'll be better for a sleep." The storm battered the house. Colin settled down to spend the evening with his favourite book. This was a musty old ledger, covered with brown suede. Over 100 years ago, one of the rectors of Alderley had copied into it a varied series of documents relating to the parish. The book had been in Gowther's family longer than he could say. Colin was fascinated by the anecdotes, surveys of the parish, and family histories that filled the book. The page that held him now was headed Extracts, Churchwarden's Accounts, 1617. Imprimis paid for ale for ye ringers and ourselves, 3 shillings and 2pence. Item to John Witch his bill for a new sally pole, 2 shillings. Item to a man it had his tongue cut out by ye Turks, 2pence. Item to a pretended Irish gentleman, 1 shilling and 3pence. Item spent for clucking to make nets, 1 shilling and 8pence. Item to a woman it was dump, 6pence. Item given to a major it had been taken by ye French and was ruinated by them, 1 shilling. But the next entry took all the laughter from Colin's face. "Listen to this. It's part of the Churchwarden's accounts for 1617. Items spent at Street Lane ends when Mr. Hollinshead and Mr. Wright were at pains to confine ye devil it was found at ye alehouse when ye new pipe was being put down and it did break into ye pit." "Do you think it's the hole at the Trafford?" Gowther frowned.
"Aye, I'd say it is. What with the pipe and all. That side of Alderley near the Trafford used to be called Street Lane Ends. And 1617, is it? It can't be part of the mines, then. They didn't come that way until about 200 years back, when West Mine was started. So it looks as though it was the well of the out pub, dunna it?"
"But it couldn't be," said Colin. "It was called Ye Pit, and by the sound of it, they didn't know it was there. So what is it?"
"Nay, dunna ask me," said Gowther.
"I'd like to know more about this devil."
"I dunna reckon much on that," said Gowther. "They were a superstitious lot in them days. I was talking to Jack Wrigley. He's the feller as put his pickaxe through the slab, and he said that when he was looking to see what he'd got, he heard a rum kind of bubbling sound that put the wind up him, somewhat to do with air pressure. Happen yon's what they took for Owd Nick."
"I dunna like it," said Bess from the doorway. She had just come downstairs. "Susan's not spoken yet, and she's as cold as a frog. And I canna think where all the sand's coming from. Her hair's still full of it, and everything's wringing wet. There's summat wrong. She's lying there staring at nowt, and her eyes are queer. If things are no different in the morning, we'll have the doctor in." Colin never knew what woke him. He lay on his back in the moonlight. He had woken suddenly and completely. He got out of bed and went to the window. It was a clear night, the air cold and sweet after the storm. The moon cast hard shadows over the farmyard. Scamp lay by the barn door, his head between his paws. Then Colin saw something move. A shadow had slipped across the patch of moonlight that lay between the end of the house and the gate that led to the Riddings, the field behind the farm. "Hey, Scamp," whispered Colin. The dog did not move. "Hey, wake up." Scamp whined softly and gave a muted yelp. "Come on, fetch him." Scamp whined again, then crawled, barely raising his belly from the floor, into the barn.
Colin pulled on his shirt and trousers over his pyjamas and jammed his feet into a pair of shoes before going to wake Garner. But when he came to Susan's door, he paused and opened the door. The bed was empty, the window open. Colin tiptoed downstairs and groped his way to the door. It was still bolted. Had Susan dropped 9 feet to the cobbles? He eased the bolts and stepped outside. And as he looked, he saw a thin silhouette pass over the skyline of the Riddings towards Clinton Hill. Colin ran, and by the time he stood up at the top of the hill, he had halved the lead that Susan had gained. For it was undoubtedly Susan. She was wearing her pyjamas, and she seemed to glide smoothly over the ground. Straight ahead of her were the dark tops of the trees in the quarry. "Sue!" Colin ran as hard as he had ever run. He came to the fence that stood on the edge of the highest cliff and looked around. The moon showed all the hillside and much of the quarry. The pump tower gleamed, and the vanes turned. But Susan was nowhere to be seen. Colin looked at the smooth black mirror of the water. He was frightened. Where was she? Then he cried out his fear, as something slithered over his shoe and plucked at his ankle. He started back and looked down. It was a hand. A ledge of earth inches wide ran along the other side of the fence. Then the drop was sheer to the water. The hand now clutched the ledge. "Sue!" He stretched over the barbed wire. She was right below him, spread-eagled between the ledge and the cliff proper, her face turned up to his. "Hang on! Oh, hang on!" Colin threw himself flat on the ground, wrapped one arm around the stump, thrust the other under the wire and grabbed at the hand. But though it looked like a hand, it felt like a hoof. The wire tore Colin's sleeve as he shouted and snatched his arm away. Then Susan's face rose above the ledge, a foot from his own, and he saw the light that glowed in her eyes. Colin shot backwards from the ledge, crouched, stumbled, fled. He looked back only once, and out of the quarry a formless shadow was rising into the sky. Behind him the stars went out, but in their place were 2 red stars, unwinking and close together. Colin sped along the hill and plunged down the Riddings to the farmhouse. As he fumbled with the door, the moon was hidden, and darkness slid over the white walls. Colin turned. "Esenaroth! Esenaroth!" he cried. The words were torn from his lips, independent of his will, and he heard them from a distance as though they were from another's mouth. They burned like silver fire in his brain, sanctuary in the blackness that filled the world. "I think we mun have the doctor," said Bess. "She's wet through again. It canna be healthy. And that blessed sand, her hair's still full of it." "Reet," said Garner. Colin ate his breakfast mechanically. Bess and Garther's voices passed over him. He had to do something, he did not know what. Colin went upstairs. Susan's door was ajar. He made himself go into the room. She lay in bed, her eyes half closed, and when she saw Colin she smiled. Colin needed help, and Fundindelv was his only hope. He went into the yard, frightened, desperate, and Albanach was striding down the Riddings. Colin ran towards him. "Albanach! Albanach!" "What is it, Colin?" "It's Sue." "What?" Albanach took Colin by the shoulders and looked hard into his eyes. "Where is she?" "I don't know. She's in bed. No, I mean—" He paused, and then began. As he spoke, Albanach's face grew lined and tense. His eyes were blue diamonds. "Can we be seen from her window?" "Just about. It's that end window at the front." "Then I would not be here." They moved round until the gable end of the house hid them from any windows. When the story was finished, Albanach laughed bitterly. "Ah, so near after all. But come, we must act before the chance is lost. Can we enter the house without being seen from the window?" "Yes." "Good. I think I have not the power to do what should be done, but we must think first of Susan. Now mark what I say. We must not speak when we are near the house. Lead me to the room. I shall make little sound, but you must walk as though you had no guile. Go to the window and open it.
Then we shall see." Colin paused with his hands on the latch and opened the door. Susan lay there staring. Colin crossed to the window and unlatched it. At the sound, Albanach stepped into the room. He held the mark of Fola open in his hand. Susan snarled, her eyes flashing, and tore the blankets from her, but Albanach threw himself across the room, striking Susan under her chin with his shoulder and pinning her arm beneath him, while he locked the bracelet about her wrist. Then, as quickly, he sprang back to the door and drew his sword. "Colin, outside!" Albanach flung him out of the room, jumped after him, and slammed the door shut. "When she is free, then must we beware," said Albanach. "Let us hope the bracelet causes such pain that escape means more than vengeance." They stood motionless. The only sound was the creaking of Susan's bed. Then that stopped. Silence. "Albanach, look!" A black coil of smoke was sliding under the door. It rolled forward onto the floor, where it gathered in an unstable pyramid, which grew. "If you would live," whispered Albanach, "stay by me." The pyramid was now some 3 feet high. Near the top glowed 2 red eyes. Near the base was what could have been a mouth. Then the thing began to grow. It grew in many directions, and it grew in spasms with moments of rest in between. Albanach raised his sword and spoke in a hard, clear voice. "Power of wind have I over thee, power of wrath have I over thee, power of fire have I over thee, power of thunder have I over thee, power of lightning have I over thee." The pyramid now filled the house. It was no longer a pyramid. It was everything, a universal darkness in which there were 2 flat discs, the colour of blood, and a ribbon of blue fire that was Albanach's sword. "Power of storms have I over thee, power of moon have I over thee, power of sun have I over thee, power of stars have I over thee." The blank eyes swam closer, now as big as plates, and the darkness began to pulse. The pulse was the rhythm of his heartbeats, and Colin could not tell where he ended and the darkness began. "Power of the heavens and of the worlds have I over thee. Power, I cannot hold it." Albanach lifted his sword above his head with both hands and drove it down into the blackness between the eyes. "Ison, Emaris." There was a glare of light and a tearing crash. The house quivered, the door burst inwards, a wind shrieked through the room, and all was quiet. The room was smashed, and the furniture scattered. The window frame had splintered from the wall. Albanach's sword was in pieces. Only Susan was undisturbed. She lay quietly, breathing deeply, fast asleep. Colin went to the bed and looked down at her. "Sue? It is Sue?" Albanach nodded. There were voices outside in the yard, then heavy footsteps on the stairs, and Gowther stood in the doorway. Bess appeared behind him. "Oh, dear! Oh, dear! Oh, 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 oh!" "Houd thee noise, lass," said Gowther. He looked at Albanach. "Now, meester, what's all this about?" "That, Farmer Mossack, was the Brollachan. I must go to Fundindelv, but I shall be back. Let Susan sleep, and see to it that the bracelet stays on her wrist, and then she will be safe. Cadellin must see her." Albanach ran from the house. Colin and Gowther spent several hours repairing what they could and patching up the rest. Through it all, Susan slept without a break. The tap at the door was so light that if they had not been sitting quietly at the table over a late tea, they would not have heard it. Albanach entered the kitchen, followed by Uthakar and Cadellin. "How is Susan?" said Cadellin. "Oh, she's still asleep," said Gowther. "And we've not tried to wake her, seeing how Albanach here said we should leave her be." "Still sleeping?" said Cadellin. "You have not taken the bracelet from her wrist?" said Albanach sharply. "No." "I think we must see her," said Cadellin.
"What's wrong?" said Colin.
"I hope there is nothing wrong," said the wizard. "Alderley came in time, and it is well he did. The Brollachan does not willingly leave a body until it is beyond repair. Susan has escaped, I hope, without injury, but it would be wise for us to see her."
They went upstairs. Susan was still asleep. Cadellin looked at her.
"It is safe to wake her, Farmer Mossop. Her body is not hurt, and she is rested."
Bess leant over the bed and shook Susan gently.
"Susan, come on, love. It's time to wake up."
Susan did not move. Bess shook her harder.
"Come on, lass, wake up."
But Susan gave no signs of waking, no matter how Bess tried.
"Mistress Mossop," said Cadellin softly, "let me try."
Bess stepped aside, and the wizard took hold of Susan's wrist and felt her pulse. Then he lifted her eyelid. He put his left hand on her brow and closed his eyes. The room was silent. A minute, 2 minutes passed. He seemed to be scarcely breathing. Cadellin opened his eyes.
"She is not here. She is lost to us."
"What?" cried Colin. "What do you mean? She's not dead. She can't be. Look, she's only asleep."
"Her body sleeps," said Cadellin. "Let us leave her now. There is something you must know."
"The Brollachan," said Alderley, "has no shape. It must take that of others. But no mortal frame can bear it for long. It is too fierce a tenant. Soon the body stretches, warps, becomes the wrong shape. Then it dwindles, crumbles, is a husk, and the Brollachan sloughs it as a snake its skin, and takes another. We came in time with Susan. Now she is safe, if we can find her."
"But are you sure it's Sue upstairs?" said Colin. "When I touched her hand last night it felt different, not a hand at all."
"That would be a memory from an earlier shape," said Cadellin. "Such things linger with the Brollachan. Its mind is slow to change."
"But where's all this getting us?" said Garner. "Susan's lying up there, and we canna wake her. Summat'll have to be done."
The wizard sighed.
"I do not know the answer, Farmer Mossop. The Brollachan drove her from her body, but where she is now I cannot see. She is beyond my magic. We shall call on other powers to find her, and until she is found she must lie here, and the bracelet of Angharad Golden Hand must never leave her wrist."
"Now see here," said Garner. "How long is this caper to go on for?"
"It will not be a short business," said the wizard.
"Then it's the doctor for her, right here and now," said Garner. "I've had enough messing about."
"Farmer Mossop," cried the wizard, "this is no matter for mortal skills. Susan's danger will increase if you do not go our way in this."
Garner looked at the wizard.
"Well, I dunna like this at all. But I've seen enough of you to tell that you know what's what in these goings-on, so we'll compromise. Unless Susan takes a turn for the worse, I'll do nought about it for the next 3 days.
3 days, said Cadellin. There is little can be done in 3 days.
Aye, well, I wouldna know, said Garner, but that's the way it is.
Then we must accept it.
The wizard rose from his chair.
Colin, will you be at Goldenstone at noon tomorrow? There is something that Susan will need.
Colin turned off the road onto the track that ran along the woodside. He came to the grey block of sandstone that stood at the border of the path and was called the Golden Stone. Uthakar and Albanach were sitting with their backs against it. "How is Susan?" said Albanach. "She's no different. Have you found anything that'll help?"
"We have not," said Uthakar, "though rest has been far from our heads and sleep from our eyes since we left you."
"Cadellin uses all his power," said Albanach, "but not even he can see where she is. But we shall not give up, and others help us. We have come now from Reedsmere. The Lady of the Lake sends you this. There will be no need of other food." He handed Colin a leather bottle. "Wine from the table of Angharad Golden Hand has many virtues."
"But you are going to find Sue, aren't you?" said Colin. How can she be somewhere else when she's lying in bed?
The Susan that sleeps is length and breadth and height, but the real Susan is none of this, said Alderley. The two you have always known as one, but the Brollachan split them like a new whetted blade in kindling.
I am thinking that Cadellin will not find her, said Uthgar. The high magic is too keen for the task.
I do not understand.
Consider, said Uthgar. It is said that the sword that lies by the sleeper in Fundindelv would cleave a hair on water, draw blood from the wind. But would you use its temper to fell this oak? So here. The Brollachan is of the old evil. It does not move on such airy places as Cadellin knows. For the old evil, the old magic is best. Against an army 1,000 strong, give me the king's sword. But for this oak, I would be having the cottar's axe.
I had not thought that way, said Alderley. But what old magic is there now?
If I were thinking, not knowing much of lore, of what would be the strongest charm for all ill times, said Uthgar, I should say the Mothan.
The Mothan, said Alderley. I have heard of it, but it is a magic plant, not easy to be found, and we have 3 days.
Tell me about it, said Colin. I'll find it.
Uthgar looked at him.
Aye, it would take such purpose as I see in you. It is a fickle plant. It grows only on the heights of the old straight track, and flowers only in the full of the moon.
It's full moon tomorrow night, cried Colin. Where is this track?
There are many tracks. All are lost. But if you stand on the old straight track, when the full moon will rise along it, then you will see it. It is hidden at all other times.
Are there any here? Said Colin, turning to Alderley.
I do not know. I have heard of them, but they were made at a time before dwarfs and before wizards, and they are part of the old magic.
I've got to find this track, said Colin. How shall I look for it?
Believe that help will come. Search. Try. Think of Susan. Never lose heart. Be here tomorrow at this time, and we may have better news. Colin walked back to highmost Redmanhay. The old straight track. The old straight track. It was all so vague. The old straight track. Yet he knew that somewhere he had heard of it before Uthgar had mentioned it. But the harder he tried, the further memory receded. Back at the farm, Colin ate a dismal meal. He had given up the search for the old straight track and was preoccupied with thoughts of Susan. Then, as often happens when the mind has left a problem, the picture that had been eluding him rose through Colin's thoughts. Got it! He hauled Gowther's suede-covered ledger from its shelf. Somewhere in these 450 pages was a reference to the old straight track. He knew he had seen it, but Colin had to thumb through the book twice before he found it. Today I walked the line of an old straight trackway made by our rude forebears. I have followed this road from Moberly to the Edge. It was engineered at so remote an era that all record of it is lost, save the frequent mounds and stones erected to indicate the way. Of these, the beacon and the golden stone are the most remarkable on the Edge, and from the latter it seemed that the trackway was aligned with the peak of Shining Tor. Colin shut the book. "Gowther," said Colin, "do you know where the beacon is on the Edge?"
"Aye," said Gowther. "It's the highest part of the Edge. You canna miss it. There used to be a stone hut on the top, and you can still see the foundations."
Gowther was right. There was no mistaking the beacon. It was a mound, obviously artificial, and it stood clear of the trees on the highest point of the Edge. Colin walked all over and about the mound, but the only track was modern, and anything but straight. From the beacon, Colin set off through the trees to the Golden Stone, along no track that he could see. On reaching it, Colin continued in a straight line past the stone until he came to the edge of the wood. Across the fields was the high ridge of the Pennines, and directly ahead of Colin the line of hills rose to a peak. Nowhere was there any hint of a track. Shining Tor, presumably, thought Colin. I'd better tell Albernac. "It could be," said Albernac. "It could be."
"Could be," shouted Uthakar. "You would doubt the wolf has teeth unless they were tearing the throat of you. Could be. It is. It is. The old magic has shown you the way to its heart, the old straight track from the Beacon Hill. There you must stand this night, Colin, and take what chance may come."
"That is what I do not like," said Albernac. "Strange memories linger on the beacon."
"What of that? I shall be there, Colin, and my sword shall keep you."
For Colin the rest of the day dragged heavily. What if it should be a cloudy night? But he need not have feared. It was a clear night when at last he crept from the farmhouse and made his way to the wood. He met Uthakar at the Golden Stone, and they walked together through the quiet darkness. "Will the moon rise along the track?" said Colin.
"I think it will," said Uthakar. "If it does not, then there is little we can do."
"And how shall I know the Mothan when I see it?"
"It grows alone among the rocks. There are 5 points to its leaves, its roots are red, and it mirrors the moon. You will know it when you see it."
They climbed up the beacon and waited. The dwarf's sword lay across his knees. "What am I to do with the Mothan when I find it?" said Colin.
"Take the flower and a few of the leaves," said Uthakar, "and give them to Susan. But see to it that you harm not the root, nor take all the leaves."
They sat quietly.
"The moon will climb from behind the hills," said Uthakar. "Stand up, Colin. Be ready."
The dwarf moved down a little way from Colin, leaving him alone at the top of the mound. There was a moment of silence, then Colin said, "Listen. Can you hear that?"
"I hear a night sound, that is all."
"Listen, it's music, voices calling, and bells of ice. And look, there's the track." Through the trees and over the beacon hill a shimmering line flowed, a mesh of silver threads, each glistening, alive. The track quivered under his feet.
"Run!" called Uthakar. "To the hills, quickly! The track will be lost when the moon passes from it. Run! Run! And fortune follow you!"
Colin leapt down the hill, and his feet were winged with silver. Trees blurred around him. He felt golden stone hard beneath him. Then he burst from the wood, and there was the old straight track, dipping and flowing over the rounded fields, and rising, a silver thread, up the face of the hills to the peak of Shining Tor, and behind it the broad disk of the moon. On, 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 on. Faster, faster the track drew him, flowed through him, filled his lungs and his heart and his mind with fire, sparked from his eyes, streamed from his hair, and the bells and the music and the voices were all of him, and the old music sang to him from the depths of the earth and the caverns of the night sky. Then the track rose before him, and he was in the hills. The moon was clear above Shining Tor, and as he sprang up the wall of the high cliff peak, the path faded like a veil of smoke. Weight took his body and pulled him from the hill, but Colin cried one great cry and snatched for the cliff top. The bells were lost in the sobbing of his breath, the drumming of his blood. He opened his eyes. Rough gritstone lay against his cheek, grey in the moon. From between his fingers, clutching the rock, curled leaves, 5-pointed, and beneath the hollow of his hand was a faint gleam of moonlight. He held the delicate Mothan cupped in his hands. He had taken the flower and 2 of the leaves. The petals flickered with a cold glow-worm light, and the fine hairs on the leaves were silver. Colin folded the Mothan gently into a leather bag that Uthakar had given, and looked about him. The old straight track had vanished, but below Shining Tor the road from Buxton began its winding drop into Macclesfield. Colin picked his way over the rough moorland down to the road. It was midnight. He felt tired, and increasingly ill at ease. The night was still, and the road lonely in the moonlight. But then Colin thought of Susan lying in bed at Highmost Redmanhay, and the Mothan in his pocket, and the wonder of the evening, and his steps grew lighter. Light steps,
That was what he could hear. Behind him. He stopped and listened. Nothing. Looked. The road was empty. It must be an echo, thought Colin, and he set off again. He heard his footsteps hard on the road, and after them an echo from the dry stone wall, and through footstep and echo a pad of feet. He stopped. Nothing. Looked. The road was empty, but the moon threw shadows. Colin walked faster. Footstep, echo, footstep, echo, footstep, echo, footstep, echo. He breathed again. Nothing but pad, pad, pad. Colin spun round. Did any shadow move? "Who's there?" he shouted. "Air, said the hill. Colin forced his brain to reason. How far to Macclesfield? 4 miles? No point in running then. He slowly turned and began to walk, and he drew steadily away from Shining Tor. He saw nothing, but the footsteps, that were never quite echoes, stayed with him. Colin was beginning to think that he would perhaps reach the town, for whatever was following him seemed content to follow. Then, approaching a sharp corner, Colin heard a new sound, and it came from in front. Hoofs, the sound of a horse walking slowly. He looked behind him, still nothing, but he could not go back. He was caught. The gentle clop of the hoofs seemed to go on forever. The road would always be empty. It was a black horse, and its rider was cloaked and wore a wide-brimmed hat. "Albanach!" "Colin, I thought you would be somewhere on the road. Have you the Mothan?" "Yes." "Come then, we'll be away to Susan." Albanach reached down and lifted Colin into the saddle before him, and turned the horse towards Macclesfield. "Why, Colin, you are wet and trembling. Is anything amiss?" The horse turned its head and looked back along the road. It snorted, and its ears flattened to its skull. Albanach twisted in the saddle. Colin felt Albanach's body stiffen, and heard the breath hiss through his teeth. Then the rein slapped the high neck, and the horse leapt away with all the tempest of its fairy blood, and the night filled his ears, and the cloak cracked in the wind. Nor did Albanach stop until they came to the Riddings, and they looked down upon highmost Redmanhay. "Why is there a light?" said Colin. "All is well," said Albanach. "Cadellin waits for us." The little room was crowded. Colin took the flower and the leaves from his pouch. "You have run well," said Uthakar. "It is the Mothan. Give it to your sister. Fold the flower within the leaves and put them in her mouth." Colin went to the bed. He folded the Mothan tightly and opened Susan's jaws with his finger just enough to work the pellet past her teeth. Then he stood back. Nothing happened. "Listen," said Albanach. Far away they heard a faint baying, and the deep winding of a horn. The baying grew nearer, and there was a jingling of harness. The horn sounded again. It was just outside the window, and Susan opened her eyes. She stared wildly about her, as though she had been woken in the middle of a dream. She sat up and pulled her face. Then Susan leapt out of bed. She ran to the window and threw it open and leant out. Colin grabbed her by the shoulders. "Kellamon!" she cried. "Kellamon! Stay for me!" Colin pulled her back over the sill, then clutched the frame to save himself from falling, for the shock of what he saw took his legs from under him. The sky was a haze of moonlight, and in the haze the stars had formed new constellations, constellations that moved, had life, and took the shape and spangled outline of 9 young women on horseback, gigantic, filling the heavens above the farm, hawks on hand, and among them hounds with glittering eyes and jewelled collars. The riders wore short tunics, and their hair gleamed along the sky. Then the horn sounded again. The horses reared and flared over the plain, and the night poured shooting stars into the western sea. Susan stood facing the window, tears on her cheek. "How is it with you, Susan?" said Cadellin. She looked at him. "Cadellin," Bess, Gowther, Uthica, Colin, Albanach. Oh, I'd forgotten you."
"Sit on the bed," said Cadellin. "Tell us what you know of these past days. But first, Mistress Mossock, will you bring Susan food and drink? It is all she needs to secure her now." While she ate, Susan told her story. She spoke hesitantly, as though trying to describe something to herself as much as to anyone else.
"I remember falling into the water," she said, "and everything went black. Then the water rushed away from me in the dark, and, well, although the darkness was the same, I was somewhere else, floating, nowhere in particular, just backwards and forwards and round in nothing. That wasn't too bad, but I didn't like the noises. There were squeakings and gratings going on all round me, not quite voices, just sounds, but they came from throats. Some were near and others far away. This went on for a long time, and I didn't like it. Then all at once I felt a hand catch hold of my wrist and pull me upwards. There was a light, and I heard someone shouting. I think now it was Albanach, and I started to move faster than ever, and the light got brighter and brighter. Then I began to slow down, and I could see the outline of the hand that was holding me. And then I seemed to break through a skin of light, and I was lying in shallow water at the edge of a sea, and standing over me was a woman, and we were holding each other's wrist, and our bracelets were linked together. And, Cadellin, I've just realized, hers was the same as mine, the one Angharad gave me."
"Aye, it would be," said the wizard. "No matter. Go on."
"Well, she undid her bracelet and slipped it out of mine, and we walked along the beach, and she said her name was Celimon, and we were going to Caer Rigor. We joined the others and rowed out above the sea towards Caer Rigor, and everyone was excited. Then suddenly there was this bitter taste in my mouth, and all the others had it too, and no matter how hard we rowed, we couldn't move forward. Celimon said we must turn back, so we did, and the taste in my mouth got worse until I thought I was going to be sick, and I couldn't keep my balance, and I fell from the horse over and over. I was falling for hours, and then I hit something hard, and I was here. But where is Celimon? Shan't I see her again?"
"I do not doubt it," said the wizard. "Some day you will meet and ride over the sea to Caer Rigor, and there will be no bitterness to draw you back, but everything in its time. And now you must rest."
They left Susan with Bess and went downstairs to the kitchen.
"Caer Rigor," said the wizard. "Caer Rigor. It is well you found the Mothen when you did, Colin, for once there neither the high nor the old magic would have brought her back. 3 times the fullness of Pridwen we went into it, except 7. None returned from Caer Rigor. That is how it is remembered in song. Aye, it is not often the old magic does so much good."
"What do you mean?" said Colin. "It's not black magic, is it?"
"No, Colin. The old magic is not evil, but it has a will of its own. It may work to your need, but not to your command. And again, there are memories about the old magic that wake when it moves. They too are not evil of themselves, but wrong for these times."
"It is indeed so," said Albanach. "The hunter was on the road. He came down with Colin from his bed on Shining Tor."
"What?"
said Colin. "Who's this? On the road? I heard someone following me."
"An old memory," said the wizard. "No harm came of it, so no more need be said now. Let me try to explain what Susan has just told us." "Surely to goodness you dunna reckon much on that," said Gowther. "It was not but a dream." "I wish I could dismiss it so, but it is truth," said Cadellin. "The Brollachan thrust her from the level of the world that men are born to, down into the darkness and unformed life that is called Abred by wizards. From there she was lifted to the threshold of the summer stars, as far beyond this world of yours as Abred is below. And few have ever gone so far, fewer still returned, and none at all unchanged. She has ridden with the Shining Ones, the daughters of the moon, and they came with her from behind the north wind. Now she is here. But the Shining Ones did not leave Susan of choice.
For through her they may wake their power in the world, the old magic. And Susan was not prey of the Brollachan by chance. Vengeance was there too. She was saved, and is protected only by the mark of Fola, her blessing and her curse. For it guards her against the evil that would crush her, and it leads her ever further from the ways of human life. The more she wears it, the more need there is to do so, and it is too late now to take it off. Is that not enough, without calling the old magic from its sleep? I should be lighter in my heart if I knew that what you have quickened this night could as easily be laid to rest. Colin lay awake. Beneath the open window he had heard a soft, familiar sound. Pad, 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 pad. He jumped out of bed and crept to the window. The farmhouse hid the yard in shadow. Colin listened, but there was now no sound. Across the yard, the roof's shadow was a straight line along the shippen wall, and above this line was the shadow of a pair of antlers, the curved, proud antlers of a stag. The shadow moved and was lost. Pad, pad, pad. The night was silent, once the footsteps had died away. The next morning, Susan appeared to be in no way the worse for all that had happened to her. Days passed. Susan found that she was rapidly forgetting what had happened to her between the fall into the quarry and her swallowing of the Mothan. She was more concerned over Colin's experience with the Brollachan, and his story broke her sleep for several nights. Colin tried to describe what he had seen in the sky after he had pulled Susan from the window. The clearest picture he could give was to liken the riders and their hounds to the figures in the star maps in his encyclopedia. But this did not match Susan's knowledge of the riders. To her, Celemon had been a normal person, as solid in her state of existence then as Colin was to her now. And neither of them could make anything of the footsteps Colin had heard, nor did Gowther help when they asked him if there were any deer on the edge. "Why, no," he said. "There used to be some at Alderley Park in Lord Stanley's time, but they went years ago." What excited Susan more than anything else was Colin's finding of the old straight track, and his journey along it to the Mothan. And when they climbed up from the Holywell late one day and saw the beacon mound dark in starlight above them, Susan could not pass it by. "Let's go up," said Susan. "I'd like to watch the moon rise. I suppose there's no chance of seeing the track, but I want to be there so that I'll know how you felt." "What about Bess and Gowther?" said Colin. "It's late already, and it'll be another half-hour before the moon rises." "They know where we are," said Susan. "Come on." Colin followed Susan up the bare slope of the beacon, and he pointed out the line of the track. Then it was a matter of waiting for the moon, and before long the children were both bored and cold. "Have you got a match with you?" said Susan. Colin turned out his pockets, and at the bottom of the fluff, crumbs, and balls of silver paper he found one grubby matchstick. "Do you think it's safe to light a fire?" said Colin. "It should be. There aren't any trees here, and this sand will stop it from spreading." The children gathered kindling of rowan twigs, and among the trees at the bottom of the hill they found a naked, long-fallen pine, as smooth as bone. "Don't build it too dense," said Susan, "or it won't start." From match to twig to branch the light grew, until the pine wood spurted fire. The flames leapt high, and within seconds the whole pile roared. Colin and Susan threw the wood they had gathered onto the flames, but the more they threw, the faster the wood burnt. "It'll get out of control if we don't watch it," said Colin. "There's too much resin in the wood." But Susan ran down to the pine tree and began to pull on a heavier branch. "Here, come and give me a hand, Colin. This'll make it really go." "No," said Colin. "Don't put any more on. There's something wrong. I'm cold." "It's only the wind," said Susan, and she started to drag the branch backwards up the hill. Colin caught hold of her arm. "Sue, can't you feel it?" It's not giving out any heat."
"Who now brings fire to the mound at the eve of Gomrath?" said a voice behind them.
Colin and Susan turned. The flames were a scarlet curtain between hill and sky, and within them, and part of them, were 3 men. At first their tall shapes danced and merged with the blazing pine branches, but while the children looked, they became more solid, and independent of the flames through which they stared. Then they were real and terrible. They were dressed all in red. Red were their tunics, and red their cloaks, red their eyes, and red their long manes of hair bound back with circlets of red gold. 3 red shields on their backs, and 3 red spears in their hands. 3 red horses under them, and red was the harness. Red were they all, weapons and clothing and hair, both horses and men. The middle horseman stood in his saddle, and raised a glowing spear above his head. "Lo, my son, great the news! Wakeful are the steeds we ride, wakeful are we, the horsemen of Don, ein Herjar of the Herlathing. Lo, my son!" Then the 3 horsemen rose slowly out of the fire, and the flames splashed from them to the ground, red mercury. They loomed black against the glare of the hilltop, but ragged beards of light still played along the heads of their spears. "Run!" said Colin to Susan. But they were not halfway to the trees before there was a drumming of hoofs, a flutter of cloaks, and Colin and Susan were hooked off their feet and thrown across the necks of horses that hurled themselves through the night as though world's ruin were at their heels. Susan began to flog both horse and rider with her arm. The rider grasped her wrist and looked at the mark of Fowler. Then he lifted her with one hand and set her in front of him astride the horse. Southward from the beacon they went, by Windmill Wood and Bent's Wood, past Higher House and Jenkins Hay, down the long back of the edge. Then they came out upon wide parkland, and before them stood a mound, and on its top was a close group of pines. The horsemen drew rein. Sheets and pennons of mist lay in the air, and the mound rose darkly through them. The leader moved forward to the foot of the mound, raised his spear, and cast it up into the trees. As it sped, it kindled from the flames that ran along the edges of the blade, and it glanced off the trunk of the nearest pine, and swooped back into the red hand that had sent it. The flames on the shaft died, but the trees were now ablaze. The fire roared and towered, as it had done at the beacon, and again there was no heat, nor did it appear to consume the trees. "Wakeful are the sons of Argatron, wakeful Ulmrig, Ulmor, Ulmbeg, ride ein Herjar of the Herlathing." A breeze stirred the mist, and the flames trembled, and it seemed that there was movement within them, and voices. "We ride, we ride!" And out of the fire came 3 men. Their cloaks were white, fastened with clasps of gold, and a whip was in the hand of each. Their hair was yellow, tight-curled, and their horses white as the first snow of winter on the black mountain of the lean north wind. As soon as they appeared, the red riders turned about and away again into the night. Colin glimpsed white cloaks falling into line behind. It was a short ride, through park and wood to Fernhill, 5 stark pines on its crest. Again the spear flew, again the trees blazed, and the voice called, "Wakeful the son of Dunath, North King, Mound King, wakeful is Fionn in his hill, ride ein Herjar of the Herlathing." "I ride, I ride." A lone figure came from the trees. His face was heavy-browed, his beard plaited, 2 forked, his mane black, awful, majestic. He wore a tunic of coarse hair without any cloak, and a round shield with 5 gold circles on it, and rivets of white bronze hung from his neck. In his hand was an iron flail, having 7 chains, triple-twisted, 3-edged, with 7 spiked knobs at the end of every chain. His horse was black and golden-maned. Now down they rode, the red and the white and the wild king, over Monk's Heath, a mile to Sodger's Hump with its ring of pines.
Wakeful is Falaman, son of Melimbor, wakeful is Bagdas, son of Tol. Ride, ein Heriar of the Helathing. We ride, we ride. Round heads of black hair they had, the same length at neck and brow, and their eyes gleamed darkness. They wore long hooded black cowls, and carried black, wide-grooved swords, well balanced for the stroke. The horses were black, even to the tongues. Wood and valley and stream swept by, field and hedge and lane, by Capesthorne and Wisterfield, 3 miles and more, Windy Harbour, Withington, Weltrough, and there stood Broad Hill, the Tunstead of old, and its pines flared red under the spear. Wakeful are the sons of Ormar, wakeful Maidoc, Midhere, Mathramil, ride, ein Heriar of the Helathing. We ride, we ride. Their cloaks were rain-washed sky. Their yellow manes spread wide upon their shoulders, 5 barbed javelins in their hands, and their silver shields with 50 knobs of burnt gold on each, and the bosses of precious stones. They shone in the night. The horses' hoofs were polished brass, and their hides were cloth of gold. Now the Einherjar were complete. They turned towards Alderley and the Beacon Hill, and for a long time after the tracks of the horses endured in the turf, and on the rocks with the fury of the riding, and the air behind them was all aglow with little sparks. The riders approached the beacon without any slackening of speed, and when they reached it, they swung in a circle about the mound, and pulled their horses to a halt. The leader rose slowly to the top of the mound and into the fire. He stretched his spear downwards and touched the ground with its point. The old straight track flowed from the spear, but now it was not moon-silvered, as Colin had seen it, but a tumbling river of red flame curls, which darted through the wood and beyond sight. The horseman lifted both his arms and threw back his head. Wakeful is he in the hill of the dawn, wakeful is he to the flame of the Goloring. From heat of the sun and cold of the moon, come, Garanhir, Golassa, lord of the Helathing. All was quiet. No one moved. Then faintly from a distance there came a voice, clear like a blend of trees and wind, rivers and starlight, nearer, nearer, chanting, wild. And am I not he that is called Golassa? Am I not a prince in darkness, Garanhir, the torment of battle? Where are my reapers that sing of war, and a lance-darting trembling of slaughter, of the booming of shields in the cry of the sword, the bite of the blue-headed spear in the flesh, the thirst of the deep-drinking arrows of wrath, and ravens red with the warring? And away among the trees appeared the figure of a man. He came to the beacon along the old straight track, and the light played on the muscles of his body in rippling patterns of black and red. He was huge and powerful, with the grace of an animal, at least 7 feet tall, and he ran effortlessly. His face was long and thin, his nose pointed, and nostrils flared. His eyes, night-browed, upsweeping, dark rubies. His hair red curls, and among the curls grew the antlers of a stag. The horseman answered him. Swift the hoof and free the wind, wakeful are we to the flame of the Goloring. From heat of the sun and cold of the moon, hail Garanhir, Golassa, lord of the Helathing. The runner came to the circle and sprang in a stride to the top of the mound. All the horses knelt, and the riders lifted their arms in silence. Susan looked at him, and was not afraid. She knew what made the horses kneel. Here was the heart of all wild things. Here were thunder, lightning, storm, the slow beat of tides and seasons, birth and death,
the need to kill, and the need to make. His eyes were on her, yet she could not be afraid. He stood alone and still in the cold flames, and they flowed round him and took his shape, so that he was outlined in blood, and scarlet tongues streamed upwards from the points of his antlers. He seemed to draw the light of the fire to himself. It dwindled, and the flames sank as though they were being pulled down through his flesh, and he grew not in size, but in power, until the only light was that of the moon, and he stood, black, against it. Then he spoke. "It is long since Wendfire kindled the Gollering. What men had remembered the eve of Gomrath?" The two riders carrying the children moved forward. "It is good to wake when the moon stands on the hill." The rider lifted Susan's arm and showed the mark of Fola white on her wrist. It glowed with more than reflected silver, and the black characters engraved on it trembled. The dark majesty dropped on one knee, and Susan's hand was taken and laid upon a cold brow. Then he rose, and lifted Colin and Susan from the horses, and put them down at the top of the mound, and turned away. "Ride, Einherjar of the Herlething! We ride! We ride!" Turf spattered the children, and for an instant the night was a tumult of rushing darkness, and then the children were alone. "That's what I saw in the farmyard," said Colin. "That's what followed me." "They didn't care what happened to us," said Susan blankly. "He followed me right back to the farm."
"Now, was that bravely done?"
A dwarf was standing under the trees. "Uthakar!" shouted Colin, and they ran down the hill to meet him. "Uthakar? Who are you?" said Susan. The dwarf looked at them.
"How shall we undo all this?"
he said. He was dressed in black, and there was a gold-hilted sword at his waist. He carried himself proudly, and his voice was firm. "What have we done wrong?" said Colin.
"None but fools would bring fire to the mound at any time, but to do so on this night of all nights of the year, and to burn Wendwood. What is Cadellin thinking to let you from his sight? Come, we must see what your friends will do. It may not be too late to put them back in the mounds."
"But we'll never find them," cried Susan. "They galloped off like the wind."
"I think they have not gone far," said the dwarf. "Let us see."
The children ran to keep up with him. "Who were they?" said Colin.
"The wild hunt, the Herlething. That is what you have sent out on us. It was enough to rouse the hunter. He alone would have taken some laying. But now that the Einherjar ride after him, we shall have to act quickly, or wide numbers will go to sleep with light in their eyes, and only the raven will find profit. But quiet now. I think we are on them."
They had come to a cliff-top over a valley. They crawled along to where the cliff fell away to a sloping bank, and from this bank they could see clearly. They were at the Holy Well, and the second gate of Fundindelv. Along the path that ran past the well, the Einherjar were drawn in line, and at the well was Garner, the hunter. He held a cup of white metal, and the riders took it, one after the other, and drank deeply, then lifted it and poured the last drops over their heads, and moved on. For each rider Garner stooped and filled the cup from the well, and the water gleamed as the old straight track had done, and all the marsh below shone red. The dwarf worked back from the edge, and beckoned the children to follow him.
"We are too late," said the dwarf. "Now that they have drunk at the well, this is wizard's work. Listen. Do you see where we are now? Over the ridge behind us are the iron gates. Have you the opening of them?"
"Yes, I think so," said Susan.
"Then go to Cadellin. Tell him that the Einherjar ride. We shall keep watch here."
Susan disappeared, and a few minutes later the ground quivered under their feet, and the skyline of the ridge was tinged with blue. Although the light was not good, Colin could tell that the riders were milling together, and he could hear hoofs stamping restlessly. "I think they're going," said Colin. "What shall we do?" A dry scrape of metal answered him. He saw the moon pale on the gold-hilted sword as it came from its sheath, and pale in the eyes behind the sword. "We shall walk," said the dwarf. As she entered the tunnel, Susan thought she heard Colin shout, but the noise of the rock and clang of the gates drowned his voice. Susan hesitated. Then she told herself that if anything had begun to happen, there was even more need to find Cadellin quickly, so she turned and ran down the tunnel. This was the long approach to the wizard's cave. The whole labyrinth of Fundindelv lay between, and soon she realized that she did not know the way. An hour passed before Susan reached the cave. Uthakar and Albanac were with the wizard. "What is it, Susan?" said Albanac. Einherjar, the hunter." "The Einherjar," said Cadellin. He began to run up the short tunnel that led to the holy well. "Wait," called Susan. "They're just outside." The wizard took no notice, and after him raced Albanac a stride ahead of Uthakar. By the time Susan reached the well, they were all standing on the path, and the dwarf was studying the ground. The light had gone from the water, and the woods were silent. But then Uthakar said, "They were here." "And they have drunk of the well," said Albanac. "We must find them," said Cadellin, "though I doubt if they will be compelled to the mounds. It is bad." "It is worse," said Uthakar. "I am thinking that this is the eve of Gomrath, and I smell wendfire." "It cannot be," cried the wizard. "I'm afraid we did it," said Susan. "We lit a fire on top of the beacon. That's what started it all. They came out of the fire." "Why should you light a fire there?" said Cadellin. "We were waiting for the moon to rise, and we were cold." The wizard shook his head. "It is my fault," he said to Albanac. "Come, we lose time. We must find their track." "Colin will know which way they went," said Susan. "They were keeping watch from across the valley." "They?" said the wizard. "Yes," said Susan. "Colin and the dwarf." "What dwarf?" said Uthakar. "There are no others here." "Yes, there is," said Susan. "He's dressed in black and—" "Dressed in black, was he?" said Uthakar. "And was there a golden hilt to his sword?" "Yes." "Do you know him?" said Cadellin. "Know him? Ah, no, yon viper, I know him. I tell you this, though you looked, you would not find from sea to sea a worse dwarf than Pellis the False." "There is a mind at work against these children," said Cadellin. They had returned to the wizard's cave, and were sitting at the long table. Atlendor had joined them. "Pellis is not here," said Uthakar, "and where he is, there I would be, for I am thinking the death of him is in my sword." "Then go," said Cadellin, "but take care in the night." The dwarf rose and was about to enter the tunnel when Atlendor spoke. "Uthakar Hornskin, you will not go alone. It is on me to go with you." "As you wish," said Uthakar, and dwarf and elf left the cave together. "Their swords will be about their own ears," said Cadellin, "if danger does not unite them." "I must do something to find Colin," said Susan. "Susan, there is danger for you outside Fundindelv. You must stay here." "But Bess'll be nearly out of her mind." "I'm glad you think of her," said Cadellin. "Do you see the pain you cause by meddling in our world? I must speak to Farmer Mossock now, and tell him that you will not go home until this matter is settled." The wizard left the cave. "I can't stay cooped up here," said Susan. "I've got to get out and find Colin."
"There is nothing we can do now, Susan. We may need all our strength later, so try to sleep. I know that I am spent."
"But I've got to get out."
"And how long is it since you were eating your heart away to get in?" said Alderley.
Susan flung herself onto the bed of skins, choked with frustration. "Alderley," she said, "who is the hunter, and what did we do?"
"He is part of the old magic," said Alderley. "And I think that what you did was not brought about by chance. The old magic has been woken, and it has moved in you, and it led you to the beacon. In the time before the old magic was made to sleep, it was strongest on this night, the eve of Gomrath, one of the 4 nights of the year when time and forever mingle. And Wendfire was lit at the Gollering, which is now the beacon, to bring the Einherjar from the mounds and the hunter from Shining Tor. For the old magic is moon magic and sun magic, and it is blood magic also, and there lie the hunter's power and his need. He is from a cruel day of the world."
"You keep saying the old magic has been woken," said Susan. "But if it's as strong as this, how did it ever come to die out?"
"That is the work of Cadellin," said Alderley. "To wizards and their high magic of thoughts and spells, the old magic was a hindrance, a power without shape or order, so they tried to destroy it. But it would not be destroyed, it would only sleep. And at this season called Gomrath, which lasts for 7 nights, it sleeps but lightly."
"So there's nothing bad about it at all," said Susan. "It just got in the way."
"Yes, but as ages pass, the world changes. So it is true that the old magic is wrong for these times."
"But it's more natural than all these spells," said Susan. "I think I understand it better than anything here."
Alderley looked up. "You would say that, but it is woman's magic too, and the more I see, the more I know that the mark of Fola is part of it."
"What does the hunter do? What's he for?"
"Do? He is, Susan. That is enough. There you see the difference between the old and the high. The high magic was made with a reason. The old magic is a part of things. It is not for any purpose." Susan could feel the truth of what Alderley said, although she could not understand it. She thought again of Colin. If only she had stopped when she heard him shout, "Pelis the False."
"Alderley."
Alderley was sitting with his head resting on his arms. Susan listened as Alderley's breathing grew deeper. He was asleep.
"And there's nobody else here," she thought. "That tunnel goes straight to the Holy Well."
She moved quietly and tested every step until she reached the wall behind the well. She laid her hand on the long crack in the rock and spoke the word of power. The grinding of the rock echoed down the tunnel, and Susan forced herself through the opening. Then she ran. Uthakar and Atlendor sat in the moonlight on Castle Rock. "He is not in the wood," said Uthakar, "and from here the world is wide."
"If he is not in the wood," said Atlendor, "think you he may be under it?"
"Is it that the Leos Alpha have cunning?" said Uthakar, "for that is just what Pelis the False would be about. Where better to hide than where he was last seen? There are places close on Saddlebowl beyond the iron gates. Quickly." They sped through the woods to a hollow above a dark slope of beeches. Here there were many recesses, and caves, and cramped tunnels into the rock. Atlendor drew his sword, and approached one of the tunnels. "Nay," said Uthakar, "you have not the eyes for it. If he is there, cold death is your destiny."
"But I have the nose for it," said Atlendor. "The cave that holds a dwarf is not to be mistaken."
"To it, then," said Uthakar. He watched the elf's hips slide into the opening.
"The air is foul," called Atlendor, "but I doubt that he is here."
Uthakar swore an oath and turned away in rage. And as he did so, he had a glimpse of a snarling, fanged red mouth and eyes of green fire set in a broad head, with short ears bristling sideways from the flat top of the skull,
and of white claws, and all hurtling towards him through the air. He was knocked spinning by a glancing blow. As he staggered to gain his balance, Uthakar saw that the third shape was already halfway into the opening through which Atlendor had passed. Uthakar sprang forward and just managed to get both hands to the short, bushy tail as the flanks disappeared. It felt as though he was holding a half-released spring of irresistible power. Uthakar planted his legs on either side of the hole and threw himself backwards. The hind feet lashed at him, but he avoided them, and by swinging from side to side he managed to keep them from winning fresh purchase in the ground. But he knew that he could not hold out for long.
"One-eyed Hornskin, who blocks the hole?"
"If the rump tail should break," shouted Uthakar, "your throat will know that."
Uthakar's shoulders felt as though they were being torn from his back, and the power to grip was leaving his wrists. There had been no reply from Atlendor. Then the body kicked under him and went limp, and before he could prepare himself, all resistance went, and he fell backwards, pulling a dead weight on top of him. Uthakar picked himself up and looked at the body at his feet. It was a wildcat, well over 3 feet long, and it had been stabbed through the throat. Atlendor stood by the tunnel, wiping his sword on a handful of grass.
"A Paluk," said Uthakar.
"I am thinking there is too much in these woods that has come from beyond Banaug." Every time Colin stumbled, the sword jabbed in his ribs. The pace that the dwarf demanded was not easy to keep over such ground at night. They came to Stormy Point, and here the dwarf stopped and whistled softly. A voice replied from across the rocks, and the sound of it made Colin's skin crawl. Then at the edge of the tree something moved, and began to come towards Colin and the dwarf. It was a wildcat, and behind it were others. More and more came until the ground was so thick with them that it was covered with a rippling coat of hair. Colin was surrounded by pale green stones of light. The dwarf sheathed his sword. A number of the cats grouped about Colin as an escort. They pressed close, but did not touch him. The remainder disappeared into the trees, spreading widely to kill pursuit. All through the night they travelled eastwards under the waning moon, into the hills above Swanscoe, up and down across ridges by Kerridge and Lamelode, Nab End and Oldgate Nick, and down Hoo Moor above the Dale of Goyt. Mile after mile of killing ground, bare of all trees and broken only by gritstone walls. And then, deep at the bottom of the moor, they came to a small round hill on which rhododendron bushes grew thickly, and about the hill curved a track. They followed the track into the rhododendrons. Far below on their right, a stream sounded. Colin grew increasingly more uneasy. There was something here, in this rank garden set in the hills, that was not good. The track divided, and the cats drove Colin to the left-hand fork. Colin stopped, in spite of the cats. Before him, on a terraced lawn, was a house, big, ugly, heavy, built of stone. The moon shone palely on it, yet the light that came from the round arched windows and the open door seemed to be moonlight also. "We are home," said the dwarf. It was the first time that he had spoken for several hours. The cats moved forward, and at that instant a cloud slid over the moon. "Stay!" cried the dwarf. As the moon disappeared, the light inside the house faded. Now the house lay barely visible against the hill behind it. The building lost its form and slumped. And then the cloud passed, and the moon shone on the house, and the windows threw light onto the grass. The dwarf drew his sword. "Now run," he said, and he pushed Colin towards the house. The cats surged forward, bearing him with them through the door. Colin found himself in an entrance hall. In front of him was a wide stone staircase, and from the top of the staircase a harsh voice spoke.
"Welcome! Our teeth have long rusted seeking your flesh."
Colin recognized the voice. It was the Morrigan. The cats made way for her,
as she moved across the floor towards Colin.
"No. We are so far in your debt that nothing of you shall escape from the place into which you have come, save what birds will take away in their claws."
Colin saw that she wore a bracelet. In design it was identical with Susan's, but its colours were reversed. The characters here were a pallid silver, and the bracelet itself was black. Uthakar and Atlendor sat in the wizard's cave and cleaned their wounds. "It is not I that will be going out again this night," said the dwarf. "If Susan has stepped through the gates and we found anything of her, it would not be worth the finding. There is a palug in every tree." Both he and the elf were gashed with deep wounds, and their clothes were in strips. "She has the mark. That may keep her," said Albernac. The noise of the opening rock had made Susan lose her nerve. She thought Albernac would be only seconds behind her, and with no idea of where she should look for Colin, she ran blindly. Somewhere in the wood she stopped for breath, and the air quietened round her. She could almost hear it rustling to a halt about her. But this was not imagination. There had been a quick dying of movement into silence. Susan stared so hard all around her that the blackness seemed to be spotted with light, pale flecks of green. And then she noticed that instead of swimming in rainbow patterns, as such lights do when the eyes strain against darkness, these lights were grouped close to the ground, motionless, in pairs. They were eyes. She was surrounded by a field of green, unwinking eyes, every one fixed on her. The cats closed in. Susan was too frightened to move until one of the cats hissed and lunged at her with its claws. Susan jumped in the opposite direction, and here the cats gave way and made a green passage for her, and their intention was plain. She found that she could move freely where they wished her to go, but if she veered from that line or tried to stop, claws were unsheathed. She knew that whatever the danger was that Cadellin had feared, these cats were part of it. There was too much intelligence in their movements for them to be ordinary cats. So, for a while, just as had happened earlier with Colin, Susan was herded through the wood. The cats did not touch her, but they walked close and urged her to run, and this eagerness showed Susan her weapon against them. She had been stumbling at nearly every step, but a violent twist of her ankle threw her sideways, right off balance. She flung out a hand to break her fall, and the cats leapt away. Susan crouched on her knees and looked at the circle of cats. She stretched out her wrist, and they fell back, spitting. They were afraid of the mark. She stood up and took the bracelet off her wrist and gripped it so that it formed a band across her knuckles. Then she stepped forward, swinging her hand in front of her in a slow arc. The cats gave way, though they snarled and twisted their heads from side to side, and their eyes flashed hate. Slowly she turned about and began to walk, and the cats let her pass, though they flanked her as closely as before. Now it was a matter of fighting every step, because the cats did not give an inch willingly, and if Susan could have found the strength to hold out mentally against all that was concentrated on her, she would no doubt have been able to reach Fundindelv unharmed. But the malice ate into her will, and she was very frightened and alone. The strain was too great. Thrusting the mark in front of her, she plunged forward, with no other aim beyond immediate escape from the pressure of those eyes. And of course she did not escape. The cats bounded after her, no longer milling round her, but streaming close, driving her, faster and faster, waiting for their moment. And it came. Susan was running so wildly that only luck kept her upright, but that could not save her when she came to the top of a rise and the ground ended under her feet. She fell onto a wide path and sprawled headlong. The mark flew from her grip and bowled across the sand towards the far edge of the path. Susan scrambled after it, but she was too late.
Below the path the hill fell steeply to the plain in a scree of pebbled sand and boulders, and already the bracelet was gathering speed down the slope. The cats were 10 yards away. She leapt down the scree after her bracelet, and after a few steps her weight began to run away with her. Her legs scissored into strides, each one raking longer than the last. She could not control her body, and the mark of Fowler drew away from her, travelling faster than she was, and increasing its speed, dancing over the stones. Then it hit a boulder, and sprang into the air, and at the peak of the bound it stopped and hung, spinning, but did not fall. At first the bracelet was a clean band of silver catching the moon, but then it began to thicken raggedly into white fire. The fire grew broader, and there was now no bracelet, but a disk of light with a round black centre, and the disk grew until it filled all Susan's vision. The edges of the fire came towards her, and the black middle receded, so that instead of a disk it was now a whirling tunnel, and Susan was rushing into it. The ground vanished from under her feet, and she ran. The tunnel spun about her so that she felt she was running on the roof and on the walls as often as on the floor. She ran timelessly, but the black circle in front of her slowly began to increase in size, and the blackness was no longer even, but speckled with grey. The contrast grew with the circle, and colours started to emerge, and Susan was looking at trees and water and sunlight. Then the circle was bigger than the fire, and soon it was a complete picture, fogged with silver at the edges, and that thinned like dawn mist. And Susan ran out of the tunnel onto grass. She stopped, breathless, and looked about her. She was standing on an island, thick with trees in the middle of Reedsmere. But it was now day, and by the warmth of the air and the glint of light on the water, the song of birds and the green on the trees across the lake, it was summer too. Angharad Goldenhand, the lady of the lake, was standing among the trees, tall, slender, dressed in long robes, her hair the colour of gold, and in her hand was Susan's bracelet. Angharad smiled. "It is time for you to know more of your place in these things," she said, and she fastened the bracelet on Susan's wrist. "Come with me." They went through the trees to a clearing, and there they sat down. Susan felt the burden of loneliness slip from her as Angharad spoke, for Angharad knew all that had happened. "Little of this is chance," she said, "for good or evil, and on your shoulders it may all lie. All your danger rests with the Morrigan. She is here, and revenge fills her heart. She has Colin at this moment, and will use him to destroy you if she can." "But why me?" said Susan. "When you put on the mark, you put on a destiny," said Angharad. "For this is moon magic, and we wear a part of it." She held out her wrist, and Susan saw a white bracelet there. "Our power waxes and wanes. Mine is of the full moon, the Morrigan's is of the old, and the moon is old now, so she is strong." "Then how do I fit in?" said Susan. "You are young, and your bracelet is the young moon's. Then you can be more than the Morrigan if you have courage. I am able to help you guard against the Morrigan while the moon is old, but that is all. Revenge was great in her, and now she will know that you wear the mark. The new moon is always her fear, and at this time above all, for it will be the Moon of Gomrath, when our magic was strongest in the world, and may be yet again. The Morrigan will try to destroy you before you take on the power. You must carry war to her now, and hold her. If you succeed, she may never be a threat to us. If you fail, grow beyond confining. Now take this." Angharad gave Susan a leather belt. From it hung a small, curved horn, white as ivory, and the mouthpiece and the rim were of chased gold. "She, in her art, will call on other power, and you will have little. So take this horn. It is the third best thing of price that was ever won. and is called Anchalach. Blow it if all else is lost, but only then. For once Anchalach sounds, you may not know peace again, not in the sun's circle, nor in the darkling of the world. Remember, only if all else is lost. The magic was ending. The island swung away from her into sleep. Angharad's last words came out of a distance and echoed in her head. She could not stay awake. Susan listened to the water for a long time before she opened her eyes. She looked at the stars. She was on the bank of a river which ran along the bottom of a valley among high and barren hills. Yet close by her was a stone gateway, and beyond it a drive led into a coombe of trees. Susan began to walk up the drive. Rhododendrons had run wild in neglect, and the drive was a thread of sand that picked up faintly the yellow of the lopsided moon. The water gurgled behind the bushes, and everywhere the rhododendrons suffocated the valley. Their mass hung over Susan like a threat. She moved as delicately as a wild creature, avoiding twigs and loose stones, never doubting that she was near to Colin. Twice the path crossed the stream, and here there were stone bridges with crumbling parapets. Susan had reached a fine pitch of awareness. Her eyes used every mote of light, and she could see all that was on the path, and as much of the borders as the rhododendrons allowed. The second bridge stood at a fork in the valley, and standing close to the bridge, in the shadow of the rhododendrons, unmoving, was what looked like a man. He held a spear and a small round shield. The light caught the dome of his head and touched his chest and shoulders, but the rest of him was in shadow, and he was so still that Susan could not be sure that he was not a piece of statuary. Susan watched him, or it, for several minutes, and not once was there a tremor of life. There was no question of turning back. She knew that she must go on, and that the risk was too great to chance walking past the figure at the bridge. Susan moved back until she was out of sight of the bridge, and then she lowered herself down the bank and into the water. The stream was quite shallow, but very rocky. She could not walk silently, but the rattle of the water over the boulders covered any noise Susan made. Once clear of the bridge, she found that the banks grew higher and steeper, but she continued for another 100 yards or so before daring to leave the water. The drive was now its original width. She moved as quietly as ever, but all her wariness could not stop the gasp that came from her when she saw what was beyond the turn of the bend. The path bordered a terraced lawn, and on the lawn was a mansion of stone. All the windows glowed with a light that was stronger than the moon, but of the same quality, and lifeless. Susan knew that this was what she was meant to find. This was the heart of the evil. The Morrigan was here, and so was Colin. Above the door of the house was a square tower. A figure appeared in one of the arched windows of the tower. It was the Morrigan. She stared down at the lawn. Susan crept back along the drive. The house had frightened her. Why me? She thought. Why couldn't Ancharad tell Cadellin? She must have known. On your shoulders it may all lie, that's what she said, but I'd not be much use in there by myself. I've got to find Cadellin. But where was she? And in which direction was Alderley? She found her bearings with the help of the plough. A path ran nearly due west. Which is the right way if I'm in the Pennines, she thought. She set off up the path. Before long the rhododendron tangle ended, and in front of Susan was an empty gateway in a stone wall, and beyond this open ground, and then a ridge of mountain that dwarfed the world. But beyond the ridge, she hoped, was the plain.
and Alderley. Susan stepped through the gateway, and as she did, someone rose out of the shadow of the wall. In the open light she could see him clearly now. He was not quite as tall as Susan. His head was bald and smooth, and his ears were pointed, the eyes almond-shaped, glowing, and the nose was hooked and thin. His spear was like a leaf, and his body was covered with flat locks of hair, dense as scales. Susan could not move even when the man reached out and gripped her by the arm. But as he touched her, the mark shone fire, and a white flame streaked up her arm and cut at the hand like a whiplash. The man dropped against the wall and did not move again. Susan ran from the gate onto the open moor, but she was hardly at the foot of the mountain when there was a shout, and she saw another armed man leap over the wall in pursuit. But was he a man? There was something wrong in the way of his running. He was quick and lizard-dry over the grass. His legs raked forward in pecking strides, and the knee-joint seemed to be reversed, while below the knee the leg was thin and the feet were taloned. She scrambled upwards. A spear sighed over her shoulder and stood out of the ground. This pursuer was not going to risk closer contact, so again and again she ran on, renewing her lead while the spear was retrieved and watching for the next throw. She came to a group of dead trees that stood gnarled on the hillside, and she lurched through them from trunk to trunk, grateful for their slight protection. But she was so spent that when she stumbled she could not get up. She twisted herself round, instinctively facing the danger. The creature was on the fringe of the trees, running with a spear held high. But as he passed the first tree, part of the crooked bole seemed to detach itself and rise up before him, and there was a long gleam of light that shortened and disappeared under his ribs. He screamed and fell.
"So it is Bodachs we have now,"
said a disgusted voice.
"Is there no end to the garbage of Banaug?"
"Uthakar," cried Susan, "how have you got here?"
"Is it not enough that I am here?" said the dwarf. "For the Bodach loves steep ground more than a hair of the mountain. The Iron Death would have been yours by now, and that may be yet, a Bodach dead, and not quietly."
Uthakar and Susan began to climb the hill together. "But how did you find out where the Morrigan is?" said Susan. "You've been very quick."
"Not as quick as you are thinking," said Uthakar. "It was last night that Colin was taken."
"But it can't have been," said Susan. "Everything's happened so fast. It was only about 4 or 5 hours ago."
"It was not," said Uthakar. "You have been under enchantment on the island of Angharad Goldenhand. Earth time is not there. As for me, that is simple. After moonrise, Pelis the False came to Fundindelv and spoke before the gates, saying that if you were not ready to go with him tomorrow and your bracelet in his care, he would send Colin back to us a little at a time. So Albanach kept him in talk, and I went out by the Holy Well, and when he left I followed him here. But that valley is thick with dread, and much of it will not be answered with the sword. So we shall bring Cadellin, and while he traffics with the Morrigan, I shall test the nature of Pelis the False, though I tread through a sea of Bodachs to his heart."
They were high on the mountain. The world was empty. "What are these Bodachs?" said Susan.
"The sweepings of Banaug," said Uthakar. "They are kin to goblins, but they have more heart. The scream of blades is their only love, and if they are thick about the Morrigan, we shall not win Colin easily. Will you be climbing faster?"
"Why, what's wrong?" said Susan.
"Look behind you," said the dwarf.
But Susan saw nothing except the hills back. "Where?"
"There, and there, and there, and there, in the heather."
She saw them, tongues of movement darting over the ground, backwards and forwards, in and out, lower down the hill, green-eyed.
"Scouts," said Uthakar. "It is not the Palug cat we have to fear, but the Bodach that follows. I would be putting a deal of wind between us and them.
Susan and Uthakar increased their pace, and the cats poured after them, and they began to call to each other in relays down the mountain with voices that were an ache and a desolation of the soul. Their numbers frightened Uthakar. They would swamp him in a minute, and might even smother the bracelet long enough for Susan to be killed. But the Palugs did not attack, and Susan and Uthakar came to the top of the ridge. A stone wall ran along its spine. In front was a valley and more hills, but on the other side of these was the plain. They were 9 miles from Alderley. They climbed over the wall and were about to start down the valley when they saw a line of bodachs cross into the valley to cut them off. The only way now was uphill, and the Palugs drove them on, those beyond the wall moving a little ahead. So they staggered into the trap. For they were soon on top of the hill, and the relief at the level ground was cut short by the cliff that dropped under them. The cliff was not an impossible height, but the ground at its foot was only a little less steep, and it was thick with boulders. Far below, a road wound through the hills.
"Do not think to jump,"
said Uthakar.
"You would smash your bones. Here at least neither Palug nor bodach will be on our necks, though I fear it will help us little. See."
20 or more bodachs were now in sight, and the group of 3 were ahead of the others. They stopped when they reached the Palugs and leant on their spears, gloating, and deciding which should have the pleasure of the kill, since there was little to fear in a girl and a one-eyed dwarf armed with a sword. "Behind me, and crouch low," whispered Uthakar. "I have a thought for these 3. If it should fail, then jump quickly, and trust in the lady."
"I've got this horn," said Susan. "Shall I blow it?"
"It was meant for worse than this, I fear," said Uthakar. One of the bodachs came through the Palug's ranks in 2 thudding strides, his shield high and spear poised. And as he landed, Uthakar threw his sword in an underhand arc. It caught the bodach in the stomach, and sent him writhing to the ground. With the impetus of his throw, Uthakar went after the sword. In the same movement he tore the shield from the bodach's arm, and went down on one knee behind it as the spears of the other 2 bodachs slashed towards him. They bit through the shield, but they did no harm. Uthakar grabbed his sword and the spear of the dying bodach, and flung himself backwards to the cliff before the Palugs had time to gather themselves to spring. Uthakar pushed the bristling shield and the spear into Susan's arms, and sprang back through the cats. He was over them, untouched, in 4 strides, and on top of the defenceless bodachs. The sword flashed twice, and Uthakar was among the cats with 2 shields on his arm. But the cats were ready for him. Bodies rattled against the shields about his head, and his sword was a spark of lightning round his feet. He plodded clear, and joined Susan at the cliff's edge. When the main force of the bodachs reached the top of the hill, they found a girl and a dwarf, armed, and standing on a projecting tongue of rock, so that they could be attacked only from the front and singly. The bodachs tried to rush the dwarf. However, 5 quick deaths halted them, and they stood back.
"If we could last till dawn, we should win clear," Uthakar said, "since neither the bodach nor the Palug loves the sun. But if the Morrigan should come, well then, good night indeed."
Uthakar had seen Palugs head back towards the Dale of Goit. He knew what that meant. And all the time both cats and goblins were coming out of the valley and were thick on the hilltop.
"We shall not see the sun rise if we stay here," he said. "Yet what else is there for us?"
"Do you know where we are?" said Susan.
"Aye, that much I can tell. This is Shining Tor. Between your feet the Mothan grew, and here the hunters slept."
"What? Here? Do you mean here?" She looked round at the jagged tor, her thoughts full of the light that had stared at her in the dying flames of the beacon. And then a pain struck across her arm deep into the bone.
"Oh, I've been hit!"
Susan grabbed her wrist. Yet when she looked there was neither blood nor wound. but the mark of Fowler shone with white fire, and the black characters engraved on it hovered above the face of the metal, and now she could see the word of power.
"Uthakar, I can read what's on my bracelet."
"Speak it, then."
"Tromador."
The hill shook at the word. The air pulsed at a note below the range of hearing, and the web of heaven trembled, making the stars dance, and their glittering echoed, "Tromador, Tromador," down the night, and out of the sound came a wind. It was a wind that was never imagined. It leapt on Susan's back and crushed her to the rock. Her fingers grew into every crack, and she pressed her body so close that the rock spun. For it was a wind that would take hair from a horse, and moorgrass from the ground. It would take heather from the hill, and willow from the root. It would take the limpet from the crag, and the eagle from its young, and it came over the gritstone peaks, howling and raging in blazing sparks of fire. The bodachs and palugs were rolled in a heap against the wall, and held there by the wind. Then, as it came, the wind died. Susan and Uthakar lifted their faces. 12 horsemen were close to where they lay. They sat as still as death, and in front of them was a man with 7 branched antlers sweeping from his head, cruel against the sky. The foremost rider was red, and carried a spear. He lifted it, and his voice cut like a blade.
"There is a cry in the valley. Is it not he that pierces? There is a cry on the mountain. Is it not he that is wounding? There is a cry in the woodland. Is it not he that conquers? A cry of a journey over the plain, a cry in every wandering vale."
The 3 red riders, the horsemen of dawn, levelled their spears. The white cloaks of the sons of Argatron parted, and 3 curled whips were seen. Dark Fiorn, North King, Mound King, poised his iron flail behind his shoulder, and the 7 chains rang together, softly, baleful. Fallowman, son of Melimbor, drew his black sword. It hissed in its sheath. The sword of Bagda was drawn. The sons of Ormar couched their javelins behind their silver shields, and the hoofs of their horses were brazen moons. Garanhir, the hunter, tossed his head. His voice belled, wild as a stag. "Ride, Anheriar of the Herlathing!" "We ride! We ride!" The palugs bounded over the heather, fleeing, but the bodachs knelt closely together behind their shields, holding their spear butts to the ground, the blades pointing for the horses' chests. Yet javelin and flail, whip, sword, and spear were among them before they could strike, as the Einherjar swept them like a wave, rolling their heads as shingle. "Ride, Einherjar of the Herlathing! We ride! We ride!" The broken ranks scattered, and the Herlathing charged across the hill, cutting, flaying, harrying the goblins and cats back to the valley. Uthakar pulled Susan off the rock and started towards the end of the cliff. "Let us not stay," he said. "The wild hunt has saved us. Will you now await the Morrigan?"
"But look," said Susan, "they're enjoying what they're doing."
"You have called the wild hunt, Susan. Be thankful that your head is not rolling in the dale." They worked clear of the rocks, and Uthakar made a direct line for Alderley, avoiding open ground as much as possible, and he kept the pace unbroken through the night. When day came, Uthakar and Susan were in a field at the top of the edge. The moon was low in the sky. "We are there," said Uthakar. "Close in the wood by the golden stone, the old elf road goes to Fundindelv. It will be some shield to us, for even the Morrigan cannot walk an elf road without pain."
"Come on, then," said Susan. "Let's run."
She was suddenly apprehensive. A shadow passed over her mind from the east, but before they could take another stride, they heard a voice call behind them.
Imorad! Imorad! Surata!
And at the voice, ice locked their muscles. Uthakar cried out, and after that stood still. But Susan, though there were crystals in every joint, could force her limbs to move. She turned her head, and saw the Morrigan on the fringe of some trees across the field. She held a long sword, and her right hand was stretched towards Susan and Uthakar, the fist clenched, and the little finger and forefinger extended.
"Must run,"
whispered Susan. She was able to walk, but each stride was a heavy wade, like trying to run in a nightmare. But all that Uthakar could move was his eye.
"Try, run,"
said Susan. She pushed her hand out to the dwarf and closed her fingers on his wrist to pull him along. But the moment she touched him, Uthakar felt the life flicker in his bones, and he could swing his legs, hips pushed forward, arms circling wide of the body as though in water. So together Susan and Uthakar moved into the wood, which here was only a few yards deep, and the Morrigan came after them, her sword ready.
Road there,"
said Uthakar. He put his head to the left, and Susan saw a track running straight along the other side of the wood. They willed themselves on, for the Morrigan was so close that they could hear her breathing, and tumbled onto the elf road, and the deadness fell from them. They ran along the track, the Morrigan keeping pace with them. But they noticed that she was looking at the sky, and seemed to be anxious. They were close to the golden stone when she stopped.
"Stay," said Uthakar. "She is not at ease. Beware."
The Morrigan stood, panting, 20 yards away.
"The wish of my heart to you, dwarf!"
she screamed. Uthakar threw himself to the ground, dragging Susan with him, and shouted at the top of his voice,
"The wish of your heart, Colin, be on yonder grey stone."
There was a swirl in the air over Susan's head, like the beat of a bird's wing, and the golden stone rent from top to base. Flying chips of rocks stung Susan's skin, and when she looked again, the Morrigan was not there.
"This will last for 7 nights," said Cadellin, "and in that time who can tell what they will not do?"
"I would be taking less care for the Hela thing than for the Morrigan," said Uthakar. "Ask the golden stone if I speak true."
"I can't understand that," said Susan. "She was right on top of us, and then she looked at the sky, broke the golden stone, and disappeared."
"Where was the moon?" said Cadellin.
"I didn't notice."
"It was about to set," said Uthakar. "Think you she was fearful of that?"
"It may be," said Cadellin. "Her power lies there, but she is not helpless when the moon is down. What special charge was there on her that she could not stay?" "If she was going back to the house," said Susan, "Albernac could follow her on his horse, and we might see what's wrong."
"Shape-shifting will take her, if she has need, faster than my horse," said Albernac. "But I will go if Uthakar will ride with me to point the way." "Nay," said Uthakar. "Give me the head that stays hewn, or none at all. 2 swords are no guard. Take Susan with you, then sword, hoof, and mark may keep you in daylight."
"Go with Albernac, Susan, but I beg you to take no risk," said Cadellin.
Susan and Albernac left Fundindelv by the iron gates and rode away towards Goldenstone. They were wary of every tree, but they saw no cats at all, and as soon as they were in the fields, the horse leapt forward, and they sped towards Shining Tor. Carrion birds were fighting among the heather along the top of Shining Tor. The horse walked now, and Albernac was on his guard, searching both sky and moor. They went down towards the valley. The day was still. Nothing moved. They halted in the copse of dead trees, but there was no trace of the bodach, and the rhododendrons made the valley inscrutable.
The house is on the other side of that round hill, said Susan.
We must go close then, said Albernac. But I do not like what I see, even at this distance.
When they came to the gateway, Albernac's horse flattened its ears, but went on, treading softly. In daylight, the place was still forbidding. Bushes and decayed stonework, dank, green, and the stream killing small noises, so that the skin crept in fear of unheard approaches. Susan pointed to the left-hand fork of the drive. "It's just round that bend," she whispered. They edged forward. Albernac drew his sword as they reached the corner, and Susan gave a shout that sent birds crashing through the trees. The terrace that held the lawn was strewn across the path. Where Susan had seen an ornamental pond was now a mound of rushes. The towered, glowing house was a pile of masonry and shattered walls, bracken and nettle showing through the rubble, gaunt with window arches.
"This is long dead," said Albernac.
"But it was a house last night," cried Susan. "The Morrigan was here. I saw her."
"I do not doubt you," said Albernac. "There is witch magic here. Come."
He spun the horse round and set off back along the path. "What made the house fall?" said Susan.
"No, Susan, what you saw last night was the work of the Morrigan," said Albernac. "We must find Cadellin, for I see light in this. I think that Colin is safer now than he was before, and that wherever he is, the Morrigan can reach him no sooner than you or I."
He urged the horse to the hill, and it went over the flank of Shining Tor like a banner of the wind. They were across the hill and going down towards Thursbitch below Cat's Tor, when they saw a shepherd and his dog walking along a sheep track. Albernac turned Melinlas aside and halted.
"There is a house in a valley beyond the hill," he said. "Can you say what it is?"
"Aye," said the shepherd. "Yon'll be Airwood Hall."
"How long is it since anybody lived there?" said Susan.
"I couldn't tell you, but the hall was pulled down when I was a lad."
"That is what I thought it would be," said Albernac. "Our thanks to you."
"You're welcome," said the shepherd. "Funny time of year for a procession, isn't it? Where's it at?"
"Procession?" said Susan. "What procession?"
"It isn't every week you see two folks in fancy dress up this way. I just thought there must be something doing."
"Two?"
said Albernac, drawing rein sharply. "Who else is it you have seen?"
"There was a woman passed me about half an hour since by Thursbitch yonder," said the shepherd, "making for Herwood. I've never seen anybody shift so fast. She was all dressed up in long skirts and that."
"Our thanks to you once more," cried Albernac, and Melinlas sprang away towards Alderley, and the turf flew about their heads. "I think we have her," Albernac shouted through the noise of their running. "She was there not long before us, but she did not attack, and that means she dared not. I think we have her."
The ride back to Alderley was faster than any Susan had known, faster even than that of the Harelething from Broad Hill to the Beacon, and the night red with wendfire. They entered Fundindelve by the Holy Well, straight to the Wizard's Cave.
"You must act now," said Cadellin. "She is not yet strong enough of herself to attack you, unless she can draw upon the moon. All this is moon magic. She has used it to build the memory of the house into stones of hardness, and it is there only when the old moon looks on it. If she did not gain the house before moonset, then she is barred from it until the night. And if Colin is there, he is safe for a while. You must put yourselves between her and the house while there is light, and at moonrise keep her from the house until Colin is freed."
"We shall need help, then," said Albernac. "I think we must talk with Atlendor."
They all went together to the deepest cave of Fundindelve, where the Lios Alphar sat grouped in their cantrefs, orderly and silent. They told Atlendor what they were going to do.
"Will the Lios Alphar lend their aid in this?" said Albernac.
Atlendor stood up. His eyes shone.
"We have given aid to hunt the Brollachan," he said. "This moon magic concerns us not at all, and you are pledged to ride with us, though I see word-breaking in your heart."
"My lord Atlendor," said Albernac, "is it to be said of the Lios Alphar that they will not fight black trouble where they find it?"
"Aye," when it deals with men. Too often they are the death of my people. We ride 3 nights from this, Alderley, and you with us."
He was turning away when Susan's voice halted him. "If you won't help us get Colin out of that house," she said, "we'll see how much moon magic doesn't concern you. What about my bracelet? Have you thought of that?"
"You too have pledged yourself to our need," said Athlendor.
"And do you think I'm going to help you if Colin's not safe?"
"A promise not fulfilled is none at all,"
said Athlendor. "All right, then it isn't. But what are you going to do about it?"
"You shall have 50 horse and myself to lead them, but not until the sun is down," said Athlendor. "If all is not settled by the 3rd night, the 50 and Albanach shall stay, and I shall take the rest of my people beyond Banaug."
Susan and Uthakar chose horses from among those of the Lios Alfar, and Susan also took a sword and a shield. "I shall not go with you," said Cadellin. "My duty is here guarding the sleepers. Only I can wake them. If I were killed, I should have betrayed my trust, and only in Fundindelv can I be certain of life. And though the Morrigan thrives and Colin is in her power, the sleepers wait for one whose shadow will quench the world, and I must not fail them."
"That is true," said Albanach. "It is better that the Morrigan triumph now than that the sleepers never wake." As they went from Fundindelv, Albanach took Cadellin's hand, and so only he felt the wizard's grief, and saw the light that stood beyond his eyes. They rode quickly but easily.
"The sword and shield are for Palugs," said Uthakar. "Do not be thinking to match them with a Bodach spear. That will be our work."
It was midday when they reached Erwood. They approached less cautiously than before, and Uthakar went about and through the ruins to decide how they could best prepare for the night.
"It will not be simple to guard the house," he said. "These 3 sides are level and open, but at the back there is danger. The space between the walls and the hill is small, and bushes grow thickly. The Morrigan can be very close, and we not know it. This is where we must start."
He went to the back of the house and began to cut the rhododendrons away from the rock face. Albanach started further along from him, and they worked towards each other, clearing the hill in a strip 10 yards wide. Susan pulled the fallen bushes into close piles along the edge of the shelf on which the house stood. Nothing happened at any time to make them think they were in danger. Once or twice Susan thought she heard a dog howling far away, and Albanach seemed to hear it too. He would stop his work and listen, and then go back to felling the bushes, his whole body swinging to the strokes as though he was fighting for his life.
"I would be clear of the valley until the Lios Alfar come,"
said Uthakar at sunset.
"Now what Bodachs and Palugs there may be here will creep from under their rocks and out of their holes. In open ground they will not be so deadly."
"What about the Morrigan?" said Susan. "I thought we were here to keep her out."
"The moon will not rise yet. Until then we shall see little of her," said Uthakar. "But let us make fire quickly now before we go. There is enough wood to burn through the night, and neither Bodach nor Palug seeks fire."
From under his cloak Albanach produced flint and tinder, and they managed to spark some twists of dry grass into flames, and when the bush piles were all ablaze, twilight had come. They mounted their horses and galloped along the drive to the moor. They crossed the stream to a flat meadowland where the horses would have better grazing. The sky was yellow, the black clouds of night drifting in, giving a stark quietness to the valley. A dog howled close by.
"Where is that?" cried Albanach.
"Yonder," said Uthakar, "high on the hill."
And there by the dead trees where Uthakar had killed the Bodach loped the shape of a black dog. It was as big as a calf, and so indistinct against the trees and in the light as to appear to be made of smoke. It put back its head, and the loneliness bayed again, and then the dog slipped through the wood, and they did not see it. Albanach sat with his head bowed. "The howl of Ossa," he said. But even as he spoke they heard a drumming in the air, growing louder, and the skyline was broken with movement as though an army was rising out of the heather, and down from shining Tor rode the Lios Alfar, with naked swords in their hands, and the blades like flame.
"We are come,"
said Atlendor to Albanac.
"Where is the Morrigan?"
"We have not seen her, but she will be close," said Albanac. "We did this minute leave the house. It is ringed with fires. Neither Bodach nor Palug has been found."
"I smell them," said Atlendor. "They will come. But let us go to the house and there make ready, for I smell blood too."
They rode along the drive. The light of the elves' swords in the damp air made a nimbus which was reflected in the leather of the rhododendron leaves. When they came to the fork in the path, Albanac held up his hand to stop the column. Something was wrong. They could all sense it. Then the elves swept forward to take the bend at a gallop. The house was in darkness. The fires they had left a few minutes ago had been snuffed out. In a moment the elves had put a cordon round the house, facing inwards and outwards alternately.
"Quick now," shouted Uthakar to Albanac. "We must have fire."
The wood was soon rekindled, for it was still warm. "Wind would have fed, not killed," said Albanac, "and water would have smoked. The Morrigan does what she is able before the moon rises."
"And that is enough," said Uthakar. "We must have light."
"Until the moon rises she has not the means to put more than fear and fright into us," said Albanac. "And from the shepherd's tale I would guess that shape-shifting is beyond her skill now. She sits out there and waits for the moon."
"Aye, and what then?" said Atlendor. "We must show our strength. Thus we may not be called to match it with hers. Come with me," he said to Susan,
and they rode to the middle of the lawn, where he stopped and lifted Susan's wrist above her head. One by one, the elves came to Susan. They touched the bracelet with their arrows and with their swords, and then went back to the ring of fire. When the circle was complete, Atlendor spoke in a voice that went far beyond the light.
"Here is bale for you. Here is a plague to flesh. Come, we are ready."
He clashed his own sword against the bracelet and let Susan's arm fall. There was a gasp from one of the elves below the quarried wall, and he slid round his horse's neck to the ground, a spear between his shoulders.
"One life to save a man,"
said Atlendor quietly. But before anyone could move, a voice spoke from the hill behind the ruins.
"We come! Have patience! We come!"
"That's the Morrigan," said Susan.
"But where is she, Hornskin?"
said Atlendor.
"Behind the bushes,"
said Uthakar.
"I cannot see her."
The Lios Alpha all turned to face outwards. Susan, Uthakar, and Albanac crouched below the lawn near to what had been the main door of the house.
"It is good to know where she is," said Uthakar. "If the house should come with the moon, Susan and I shall find Colin within. Do you keep the door here, Albanac."
They waited through the hours to moonrise. Atlendor guarded the fires. There was no move to extinguish them, just the reverse. They seemed to burn faster than holly. At this rate they would not last long. Atlendor hurried round, raking the fires together, sacrificing every other one for the sake of the hours left to the night. The moon shot high from a cloud, an ugly slip of yellow, taking the watchers by surprise. And the moment it touched the ruins, they shimmered as in a heat haze and dissolved upwards to a house. The windows poured their dead lustre on the grass, making pools of white in the flames.
"Now!"
cried Uthakar to Susan, and they threw themselves up the bank and put all their weight to the door. It swung easily, and they fell over the threshold. Uthakar kicked the door shut, and the wood rattled under an impact that was made of many separate blows. Points of bronze stood out like teeth. But the door was closed, and even while the echo was still loud, Uthakar and Susan were running up the stairs.
"He will not be near to the ground," said Uthakar, "and we must hurry, since he will not be unguarded either, and the fire and our coming will be plain to any."
They went from room to room, throwing open the doors, but all were empty. The house rang with their search. They reached the end of a landing, and Susan was about to charge the door when Uthakar stopped her.
"Wait, I am not liking this."
He pointed to the upper panel of the door. A design had been painted on it in black.
and there were strange characters grouped around the design.
"It is a witch brand," said Uthgar. "Come away."
"No," said Susan. "I'm going to look." She tried the handle carefully. The door opened, and Susan stepped into an enormous room. It was bare of furniture, but on the floor a circle had been drawn. It had a double rim, round which were more characters similar to those on the panelling, and in the circle was a lozenge. In the centre of the lozenge stood a bottle, which held a black substance that writhed as though it was boiling, though the cork was heavily sealed with wax, and 2 points of red light swam inside the bottle, always the same distance apart. Susan approached the circle, and the red sparks stopped their drifting and hung against the glass. Susan felt compelled to pick the bottle up, but as she reached the circle, the room was filled with a buzzing like the whine of flies, and the circle rims began to smoke. She stepped back quickly, and Uthgar caught her by the shoulder and pulled her out of the room. He slammed the door.
"The Brollachan! She has penned it here."
"That?" said Susan. "Then we must stop her from getting in here, or she'll set it loose."
"Small wonder it could not be found,"
said Uthgar. "Listen," whispered Susan. "Somebody's coming." There was one door they had not yet opened at the end of the landing. It was smaller than the others, and from behind it they heard footsteps drawing near.
"Back,"
said Uthgar.
"Give room for swords."
The door opened, and Uthgar gave a shout of gladness, for in the doorway, sword in hand, was Pellis the False. Uthgar sprang, but Pellis was quick, and the door was snatched shut in Uthgar's face. He pulled it open. Pellis was disappearing up a staircase in great bounds.
"Do not follow,"
shouted Uthgar to Susan.
"Guard here."
The stairs were not long, and at the top was a single door. Pellis was fitting a key into the lock when Uthgar reached him. He was no coward. Without a shield he stood, his sword in both hands, his back to the door, and there was not a stroke or a thrust that Uthgar made that was not parried and answered. But the advantage of the shield began to tell, and Uthgar worked Pellis away from the door and to the stairs, and once there Pellis had to give ground. Susan listened to the clash of iron and tried to believe that she could make herself use her sword. When Uthgar and Pellis came into sight, she flattened herself against the wall and watched the glittering play of blades as they swooped, leapt, and sparked about the dwarfs.
"To the room above!"
Uthgar gasped as he reached the bottom step. Susan began to edge past the fight. Uthgar increased his attack, but even so Pellis was able to make one vicious cut at Susan as she darted for the stairs. Susan looked at the key in the lock. She examined the wood, but there were no marks or lettering visible, so she turned the key and kicked open the door. It was a cell of a room, and standing against the opposite wall was Colin. When Pellis saw Colin and Susan appear behind Uthgar, he backed towards the stairs that led down to the hall. He knew that he would not go far if he turned and ran. At the top of the stairs, he cunningly parried Uthgar in such a way that he seemed to be weakening rapidly, and so, when he faltered in his guard, Uthgar brought his arm down in a swing that had all his weight behind it. But Pellis threw himself sideways, rolled over the banisters, and dropped into the hall, while Uthgar pitched off balance down the stairs. Pellis ran to a door that led off the hall. He was through, and the door closed again before Uthgar recovered himself. Susan was the first to reach the door. When she opened it, she saw Pellis for an instant against a window that stretched from the ceiling to the floor, and through which the fires on the lawn could be plainly seen. Then the dwarf hurled himself at the frame and disappeared in a splintered cascade of glass.
"Come back," said Uthgar from the hall. "If the Leos Alfar do not have him now, his life is charmed. Let us go by the door. Susan, take Colin by the hand, and when I open the door, run close by the wall to Albanach. Are you ready?"
He pulled open the door, and then clutched Susan's arm.
"Wait!"
"What's the matter?" said Colin. Uthgar did not answer, but ran across the hall to the room from which Pellis had escaped, and when the children joined him, they found him standing at the broken window, looking out into the night, which was silent and impenetrable.
"The moon is hidden,"
said Uthgar. "But the house isn't here unless the moon's shining on it," said Susan. "And it still is here."
"Aye, but where is here?"
said Uthgar,
To the valley, this house is here when the old moon is on it, and not at other times. But to the house, the valley is there only in the moon. So I am asking what is out there now, and I'm not wanting to know the answer. Let us watch for the moon to come, and then through this window as fast as we may."
There was a vibration in the darkness, and blurred lights appeared, which condensed into fires, and with the light came noise, hoofbeats, and the clash of weapons. Uthakar put his shield in front of him and jumped through the window, the children following at his back, and all three landed together on a path that was between the house and the lawn. The elves were holding their circle against both cats and goblins. If any breached the circle, they were not pursued, but were brought down with arrows, and from the bodies on the ground the fighting was not new. The elves were outnumbered by at least 2 to 1, and the cats were everywhere, a torment to the horses, and death to any elf that was unseated. Despite her opinion of the Lios Alfar, Susan had to admire their courage and skill. They were quick as hawks, yet they were calm in their speed. They ran to the corner of the house, and came upon Albernac guarding the door.
"How is it?"
said Uthakar. "They attacked with the moon," said Albernac, "but we hold them. And you?"
"Colin is here, unhurt," said Uthakar, "and the Brollachan is within, so we must hold them still."
"The Brollachan?"
"Aye, shut in a room of foul magic."
"Tell me more when there is time for thought," said Albernac. "Colin, you must have weapons, and I fear they will be ready to your hand." He crossed the lawn, and moved about among the fires, and when he came back he brought with him a sword and a shield identical to those that Susan carried. Colin fitted the shield on his arm, and tested the weight of the sword.
"Remember,"
said Uthakar,
"these are for the Paluk cat. Do not be picking quarrels with a bodach."
"We'd be a lot better off with guns," said Colin.
"Would you?"
said Uthakar.
"That is where we part from men. Though you may look here and find us at the slaughter, but we know the cost of each death, since we see the eyes of those we send to darkness, and the blood on our hands, and each killing is the first for us. I tell you, life is true then, and its worth is clear. But to kill at a distance is not to know, and that is man's destruction. You will find in the bows of the Lios Alfar much to explain their nature."
A commotion started at the bend in the drive. Instead of charging from all directions at once, the Bodaks and Palugs had formed up and had come in a body. They were through the circle and halfway to the house before anyone knew what was happening, but the elves were swift in their reactions, and they closed in right to the walls. Now the fighting was desperate, since the elves could not maneuver, but stood their ground using swords alone. The horses reared and slashed with wicked aim. Uthakar and Albernac held the doorway, the children by their side. The worst moment for Colin and Susan had come when the attack was seconds away, when they knew that they had to lift their swords and bring them down on living things. But when Colin saw the teeth and claws rising towards him, he struck instinctively, and after that the will to live was in control. The Bodaks stabbed with their spears, and leapt high to rake with their clawed feet, and the Palugs added their viciousness to the struggle. But cold patience wore down rage, and the Bodaks fell back, the elves advancing in step with the retreat until the original circle was formed again. Albernac kept the children by the house, and they sank to the ground, exhausted. But Uthakar was still in the heat of the fight, and he moved past the elves to the very limit of the fire, throwing down his shield whenever it grew too heavy with the weight of spears embedded in it, and snatching another from the mounds that littered the grass. He gave a shout, and peered along the drive.
"So it is still living you are, and well out of the fight. But I see you. My sword is waking to its hilt for you."
"Come back," cried Albernac. "Your reason has gone with the ghosts of the mountains if you think you will live to take a step further." But Uthakar was spinning his sword about his head, gathering himself to charge.
"Run, Bodaks, make way, for when I chance to come upon you as many as hailstones and grass on a green, the stars of heaven will be your cloven heads and skulls, and your bones crushed by me and scattered throughout the ridges."
And he shot forward past the light, into a din of cries and a crash of blades. "He is mad," said Albernac. "When his blood is less hot, He will wish himself far from this. The noise seemed greater than when the house was under siege, bellowing, spitting, pandemonium, out of which no one sound emerged. Albanac mounted Melinlas and rode to the edge of the circle.
"Uthakar!" "Aye!" The voice was indistinct.
"How is it?"
"There is breaking of spears about the place where I am. I will not say, but that I may retreat."
"I am with you!" shouted Albanac.
"Fool!"
answered the dwarf. But Albanac cantered back to the house, turned Melinlas, and broke into full gallop along the drive. A line of bodaks knelt on the fringe of the dark, but Melinlas soared high and safe over their heads. All the children knew of what followed was told by the sounds that came to them. And then Melinlas grew out of the night, foaming and red-hoofed. Uthakar rode behind Albanac, still cutting the air, but Albanac was low over the horse's neck, and a gold-handled sword trailed from his side. Melinlas halted, and Uthakar jumped to the ground and eased Albanac from the saddle. Atlendor came to his other side. Gently Uthakar drew the sword out of the wound. Albanac opened his eyes. They were blue and clear. "I had hoped it would not be so soon in the night," he whispered.
"Rest you until the battle dies,"
said Uthakar. "Then you will be safe." "I am safe," said Albanac. "The howl of Ossa. There is nothing to be done when that one calls." A group of elves dismounted, and made a cradle of their swords, and lifted Albanac onto it. "We shall tend him," said Atlendor, and they carried him to a sheltered place between two walls of the house. A snigger of laughter ran through the bushes outside the circle, backed by hoots and jeers.
"Was that not the foray? Well is it said that no iron is as true to its lord as is the spur. Hornskin, will you be bringing me my sword?"
Uthakar rushed out to the middle of the lawn and drove the golden sword into the turf.
"Come now without your bodaks, Pelis, son of Argad, and claim your sword," he cried. "I give you safe passage. Here is your sword. Take it."
There was a moment of silence, but then there were footsteps on the drive, and a black and gold figure came into the light. He carried a shield, and his stride was firm across the grass. Pelis the False took hold of the sword and wrenched it from the ground, and he faced Uthakar, and they came together like stags. The air shivered at their meeting. Uthakar was frenzied in attack. The guilt for Albanac's wound ached in him, and he tried to deaden it with anger. At first he had the advantage, but he was fighting more with his heart than with his head, while Pelis countered and wasted no strength. And before long the passion left Uthakar, and weariness seeped into its place. Pelis the False continued to match him stroke for stroke, and now he was driving the blade aside, and it was Uthakar's shield that rang. He retreated across the lawn, feeling his life wane from him, and then Pelis was through his guard, and the blade sank into his shoulder. The pain cleansed Uthakar's mind of all weariness. He saw that if he did not use this moment there would be no other. He threw his shield from him, and leapt a twisting salmon leap into the air, high above Pelis, and came down over his arm. The sword went through Pelis to the hilt, and the two dwarfs crashed together, the one fainting, the other dead. Colin and Susan ran forward, and lifted Uthakar, and carried him back to the wall.
"Did I kill?"
said Uthakar. "Yes," said Colin.
"The wonder is that I am not lying there, black in the light," said Uthakar. "Such rashness merits it. See how it is with Albanac."
Colin and Susan went towards the corner where the elves had taken Albanac. A sound rooted their feet, the howling of a dog, very near to the house, and in front of them. The notes rose and fell in a sadness that swept the children's minds with dreams of high landscapes of rock, and red mountains standing from them, and hollows filled with water and fading light, and rain drifting as veils over the peaks, and beyond, in the empty distances, a cold gleam on the sea. and into that distance the voice faded like an echo, and Atlendor came towards the children from the shadows of the house.
"Albanach is not here," he said.
"Not here," said Colin, "but he was badly hurt."
"He has gone to heal his wound. He will come again."
"Where is he?" said Susan.
"He was called. It is always so with the children of Danu," said Atlendor, "and we shall go. I have kept my word. Let us ride now."
"We can't go yet," said Susan. "What about the Morrigan? And the Brollachan still in there? If she lets it out, you don't know what will happen."
"I know that it has been a dear promise," said Atlendor. He looked at Colin. "One life has cost 30. It shall not take more. We ride. Make you ready."
Atlendor turned away. "How can he leave everything like this?" cried Susan. "It's not safe. We mustn't let the Morrigan get back into the house. Doesn't he realize?" "But he's right," said Colin. "You can't ask him to lose any more for something that isn't important to him." When they reached Uthakar, they found Melinda standing guard over him. The horse pricked up its ears at the sight of the children and thrust his muzzle into Colin's shoulder.
"How is he?"
said Uthakar. "They say he's gone," said Colin. "And the elves are going too."
"He knew it was to be this night," said Uthakar. "It was not in us to keep him."
"Why has he left his horse?" said Colin.
"He has no need of it," said Uthakar. "Albanach was of the children of Danu, who came to this land when all was green. They were the best of men."
"Is he dead?"
said Colin. "Not as you would have it," said Uthakar. "Say rather that in this world he has changed his life. The children of Danu are never far from us, and all their days are spent in our cause, but there is a doom on them that they shall not see their work fulfilled, since the gold of their nature might then be dulled, its power turned to selfish ends. When their leaving is close, the hound of Conner appears to them, as you have heard and seen. Ossar's howl shadows their lives."
"It makes everything so pointless," said Colin.
"He expected no less," said Uthakar, "and there was no place for sadness in him. He will come again."
"The elves are running away," said Susan.
"Then I think the better of them,"
said Uthakar. "What's the matter with everybody?" said Susan. "You mustn't let the Morrigan win."
"Can I stop her?" said Uthakar. "Listen to me. We have Colin, and there is nothing more to do, since magic holds the Brollachan in its circle. We have killed many Bodachs and routed the Palugs. When I was fighting out there, I saw but a dozen in all, and when they are spent, the Morrigan must needs come herself, and that is no stopping time for me. I fear her without shame."
"I'll stay by myself, then," said Susan.
"You will not,"
said Uthakar, and began to pick his way over the lawn to where Pellis had fallen. He came back with his sword. The Lios Alfar were backing from the circle to make a column. The wounded in the middle lashed to their saddles. "How did they know they were going?" said Colin. "I've never heard any of them speak, except Atlendor."
"It is part of their strangeness," said Uthakar. "They speak to each other through their minds, and from the looks I have seen, they hear what does not pass my lips."
Susan reluctantly mounted. Colin rode Melinlas, and with Uthakar they joined the column of the elves. The fires were dying for want of attention. The ground was broken with bodies and splintered weapons. The house stood waiting. Susan looked round her at the scene of her failure, and that is how she saw it now. To begin with, Colin had been her only motive. She had faced impossible things for his sake, but now she felt that he had been the first step to her duty, which she was now being made to leave unfinished. The Lios Alfar galloped away along the drive. The speed of the Lios Alfar to Shining Tor was like a March gale, since the moon shone freely, and they were accustomed to the light. But when they were only a little way up the slope, the feeling of wrong became too much for Susan. "Wait!" she called. The elves halted, and their eyes were turned on her. "We must go back. The Morrigan has got to be kept out of the house." "We are not bound," said Atlendor. "Come." "Uthakar, will you go with me?" "My only craft is the sword," said Uthakar, "and I fear the Morrigan more than dishonour. Come away." "Colin, you know we can't do any more, Sue." "All right," said Susan, and she drove in her heels and charged down towards Earwood. Branches whipped Susan's face, but that was little to the cold that seared her wrist. She was at the front of the house, and there on the drive, surrounded by bodachs and palugs, was the Morrigan. At the sight of Susan, the bodachs and palugs screamed, for to them she was transformed. Their hearts shook, and they fled. But the glamour of the bracelet was not on the Morrigan. She raised her hand. Now Susan felt the true weight of her danger. The moon charged the Morrigan with such power that when she lifted her hand even the noise of the stream died, and the air was sweet with fear.
Vermias, Eslevor, Frangam, Beldor.
Black lightning came from the Morrigan's hand and darted towards Susan, who threw up her arm to protect herself. And she saw the word of power standing out above the mark, and though it was not the word she had seen on Shining Tor, she spoke it. "Hurandos!" And from the mark sprang a lance of flame, which met the black of the Morrigan halfway to its target, and the two forces grappled each other, crackling and writhing like snakes.
"Salibat! Reterem!"
cried the Morrigan. The black rippled, grew in thickness, and slowly pushed the white back to the wrist. Susan rose in the stirrups, and the words poured from her lips, words that she had never known or heard. "Per sedem balderi et per gratiam tuam habuisti." The light grew again, but the Morrigan answered her, and Susan felt herself weaken. The blackness was a tentacle, and then the Morrigan's power reached her. Susan arched from the horse into nothingness. When Susan opened her eyes, the Morrigan was standing with her back to her, facing the house. Susan had tried and failed. Let Cadellin deal with this.
Besticitiam consolatio veni ad me vertat creon, 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 cantor laudem omnipotentis et non commentor,
the Morrigan chanted tonelessly, her arms outstretched.
Principiem da montem et inimicos oprostantis vobis.
Susan crept towards the horse, and she reached it as the Morrigan's voice rose to its climax.
Passium cinquissibus, fiat, fiat, fiat.
There was a noise of thunder in the house, and smoke began to pour from an upstairs window. The whole front wall burst outwards, and a cloud spilled from the house, and in the cloud were 2 red pools. Susan did not wait. She scrambled onto the horse, and as she sped away she heard the Morrigan cry out. Then she was round the corner and on the path above the stream. The Brollachan grew high over Earwood, strong in itself, and in the moon and in the power of its keeper. It saw the rider in the valley, and the elves upon the hill, and it stooped to take toll of the long centuries of prison at their hands. Susan felt the sky go black above her, and all she saw was night. She lifted the mark of Fowler, but its silver was dimmed, and the words would not come. The hill disappeared. She could see nothing. The air beat with the rhythm of her blood, and the night swam into her brain. The world drifted away. And then Susan heard a voice, urgent, the voice of Angharad Goldenhand, crying, "The horn with the wreath of gold about its rim. All else is lost." Susan tore at her waist with fingers that resisted her will and put the horn to her lips. Its note was music like wind in the caves of ice, and out of the wind and far away came hooves and voices calling, "We ride, we ride," and the darkness melted. At her stirrup was a man with tall, proud antlers growing from his brow, and he ran with his hand upon the horse's neck, and all about her were booming cloaks, red, blue, white, and black, and flying manes. And in the distance, as over a field, she saw 9 women with hawk on wrist and hounds at leash coming to meet her. The gladness carried Susan past all thoughts but one, the memory of Celemon, daughter of Kai, which the Mothan's bitterness had driven from her. She spurred her horse faster to the welcome that sang through the night, and lifted the riders from their bondage in the dark mounds. But the voice of Angharad spoke again. "Leave her. She is but green in her power." And the hunter took his hand from Susan, and drew away, no matter how she rode. It was as though she was waking from a dream of a long yearning fulfilled, to the cold morning of a world too empty to bear. The Einherjar paled, their forms thinning to air and light, and they rose from her into the sky. "Celemon!" But Susan was left as dross upon the hill, alone on the moor, the night wind in her face, joy and anguish in her heart. Colin was nearly at the hill when he saw the Brollachan grow over the trees at the same moment that Susan appeared from the valley, and he watched, helpless. The Brollachan dwarfed the hill, overtaking Susan. The cloud lifted and formed a lash like the root of a whirlwind, which swung low over Susan's head and then struck. The Brollachan flowed into that one point, and Colin's ears were stunned by a blast that knocked him to the ground. The hill where Susan had been slipped into the water, and the Brollachan hovered over it. But as his head cleared, Colin heard another sound, so beautiful that he never found rest again. The sound of a horn, as the moon on snow, and another answered it from the limits of the sky, and through the Brollachan ran silver lightnings, and he heard hoofs and voices calling, "We ride, we ride," and the whole cloud was silver. The hoofbeats drew near, and the earth throbbed. Now the cloud raced over the ground, breaking into separate glories that whispered and sharpened to skeins of starlight, and were horsemen, and at their head was majesty, crowned with antlers, like the sun. But as they crossed the valley, one of the riders dropped behind, and Colin saw that it was Susan, and the light that formed her died, and in its place was a smaller, solid figure that halted, forlorn, in the white wake of the riding. The horsemen climbed from the hillside to the air, growing vast in the sky, and to meet them came 9 women, their hair like wind. And away they rode together, across the night, over the waves and beyond the isles, and the old magic was free forever, and the moon was new.